Chapter 286. The sound of the iron ladle colliding with the iron wok resounded throughout the entire Cook's army camp, causing the originally tranquil camp to suddenly become noisy. Many people came out of the tents in the camp, rubbing their sleepy eyes. Bufang walked out of the tent and slowly walked toward the place where the crowd was concentrated. Troops usually had to assemble. Even though Bufang had never joined an army before, he still knew a little about such matters. In the Cook's army unit, the sound of the wok striking was used to replace the sound of assembly. The hat on the head of the young Long Kai was slightly askew, and he had a drowsy look on his face. The firewood in the camp was burning, emitting crackling sounds that reverberated in the surroundings. The big iron wok on the wooden frame was being roasted by the raging flames. Bubbling sounds could be heard coming from within the wok, and white steam was rising from it. Water vapor was flowing out from the wok, along with spirit energy and a faint fragrance of porridge. At this moment, Wei Dafu was carrying an iron wok. He was hitting the wok with an iron spoon, making loud noises. There was a hint of anger on his face as he looked at the slow-moving group of people. He couldn't help but shout, "Hurry up! Don't think that the Cook's army isn't a soldier. Hurry up and gather!" The Cooks immediately became spirited and stood in line. Bufang, on the other hand, calmly followed behind the others and joined the team. This caused Wei Dafu, who was narrowing his eyes to look for Bufang, to feel a little regretful. He originally wanted to use this as an excuse to scold that arrogant brat. He did not expect that the brat would actually wake up so early to queue up. A normal recruit would sleep until the sun was high up in the sky. However, he didn't pay too much attention to this. He only snorted and looked at the cooks below him. "Straighten your chest. Yesterday we received the general's order. Tomorrow our Third Army will go out to fight against the enemy. The general asked us, the Cook's army unit, to cook a sumptuous meal to satisfy the soldiers and raise their spirits, so that everyone can return victorious," Wei Dafu said loudly with his hands behind his back, acting like a vice-captain. After saying that, the cooks below started chattering among themselves. Many of them were quite excited. It was time to show off their real skills. "So, you guys know what I'm going to say. Today's dish, you guys better prepare it well. Don't lose the reputation of our Cook's army unit. Don't let the soldiers, when they eat your dish, say in disgust, 'What kind of rubbish is this?' If that happens, not only will you guys lose face, but I, Wei Dafu, will also lose face. So, all of you better do your best." Wei Dafu yelled at the top of his lungs. The cooks all held their heads high and their eyes sparkled with confidence. Especially Long Kai, that immature little fellow. He actually held his chest high and his face was filled with excitement. "All right, Long Kai. You go and distribute the porridge to each camp. When you come back later, you will continue cooking. The rest of you, go back to your camps and prepare your dishes well. If I'm not satisfied with today's dish, I will use half a month's worth of firewood." Long Kai's face fell. Reluctantly, he followed a few strong cooks to carry the steaming hot wok and left the camp. Bufang clasped his hands behind his back and slowly turned around. He was about to lazily return to his ordinary camp. However, he was stopped by Wei Dafu. "Kid, I'm watching you. If your dish isn't chosen by any of the soldiers, you know the consequences. At that time, I will let you know the price of being arrogant with me, Wei Dafu." Wei Dafu shot a glance at Bufang and coldly snorted. Bufang was taken aback. The corners of his mouth curled up and he looked at Wei Dafu as though he was looking at an idiot. He was too lazy to say anything, so he turned around and returned to his camp. There were so many ingredients in the camp. Although they were all ordinary ingredients, they were all complete. Vegetables and meat were all laid out on the ground. Picking out some ingredients that seemed to be of good quality, Bufang weighed them in his hand. Then, he began to pick up the wooden frame and set up the wok, preparing to cook. To Bufang, there was no such thing as meticulously prepared dishes or not meticulously prepared dishes. A chef who was confident in his craftsmanship would always be able to satisfy the taste of his customers and make them praise him endlessly. Holding the wooden handle, he casually spun the kitchen knife in his hand. Twirling the knife in his hand, Bufang's eyes fell on the ingredients he had picked out. Regarding these ordinary ingredients, Bufang didn't feel any pressure at all. The knife light flickered rapidly, shining under the illumination of the fire. Swish, 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 swish. Those ingredients were quickly processed by Bufang in just a few breaths. His meteor knife skill was really skillful, so processing these ingredients was a piece of cake for him. After processing the ingredients, Bufang began to prepare to cook. He first preheated the wok, then added the oil. This oil was just ordinary oil, and it didn't contain any spirit energy. It was really an extremely ordinary ingredient. The dishes cooked by the cook's army cooks were made with spirit energy ingredient. However, they were unable to preserve the spirit energy within the ingredients like Bufang could. It was very easy for the spirit energy within the ingredients to leak out. Even the chefs of large restaurants were unable to preserve the spirit energy within the ingredients, let alone these cooks. Bufang was already used to cooking using true energy. Even though this technique was more useful when cooking spirit energy ingredients, it did not make much of a difference to Bufang. This was because his mental energy was simply too strong. Even the slightest change in the ingredients would not escape his senses. The sound of stir-frying resounded in everyone's camp. In an instant, sparks and smoke rose into the sky, and the aroma of the dishes filled the entire cook's army unit. However, the cook's army unit didn't prepare too many dishes. Their main purpose was to make large portions. Because they needed large portions, it was more difficult to cook. Many of them were responsible for one dish, so they had to make a few dishes in total. The miserable cries of spirit beasts resounded in the camp. It was the sound of some low-grade spirit beasts being slaughtered and turned into dishes to nourish the soldiers' bodies. For the sake of this dish, the cook's army unit had pulled out all of their savings. This time, Bufang only made one dish. He was very fast, and it didn't take long for him to finish. He covered the dish in the big pot with a lid, and surprisingly, all the fragrance was kept inside. It didn't burst out like the others. After finishing everything, Bufang sat cross-legged on his bed, and he closed his eyes to rest. He started to think about the dish in his mind, and at the same time, he waited for the others to finish their dishes. Soon, the sound of the iron ladle colliding with the big iron wok resounded again. Bufang opened his eyes, and they were filled with excitement. His first real dish in the cook's army unit was finally going to be put to the test. However, Bufang wasn't worried in the slightest. He had absolute confidence in his culinary skills. Getting off his bed, Bufang lifted the big pot and walked out of his tent. Xiao Bai was arranged by Bufang to stay in his tent, and he obediently stayed still. When they arrived at the front of the camp, several cooks were carrying a pot, and there were already several big pots in front of the camp. A rich fragrance was emitted from the pots, and it lingered in the cook's army unit's camp. Many cooks had ruddy faces, and their foreheads were filled with sweat. It was obvious that they were excited to finish their dishes. "Brat, walk faster. Everyone is waiting for you." Wei Dafu shot a glance at Bufang, and he said in a displeased tone. Compared to the others, Bufang's pot wasn't big. However, the others didn't pay much attention to it, because the soldiers didn't pay much attention to dishes made with ordinary ingredients. Since they were going to be wasted, the pot given to Bufang was on the small side. Faced with Wei Dafu's scolding, Bufang was still unhurried, and he lazily carried his pot to the group. Wei Dafu was even more displeased. He coldly snorted and he looked at the others. "All right. Prepare to serve the dishes." Just as Wei Dafu's voice faded, "Hey ha!" the cooks immediately shouted, and then they lifted the heavy pots and walked out of the camp. Chapter 287. The Third Corps of the Western Mystery Army was the weakest among the 3 armies of the Western Mystery Army. Compared to the elites of the First Army, the soldiers of the Third Corps were much weaker in terms of cultivation and willpower. However, the Third Corps of the Western Mystery Army was a well-trained army. The cooks of the Cook's Army unit carried pots that were steaming hot and emitted a rich fragrance. Within the pots were the delicious dishes that they had spent a lot of effort to prepare. Some of these dishes were made with precious ingredients, and some were made with the meat of precious spirit beasts. The purpose of these dishes was to allow the soldiers of the Third Corps to be in their best condition after eating them. Only then would they be able to face the upcoming battle in their best condition. Dong. The heavy pots were placed in the middle of the camp. Immediately, a rich fragrance spread out and permeated the surroundings of the camp. The armored soldiers in the camp curiously looked at the pot. Although they were curious, they didn't have any expectations. This made Wei Dafu, who had been secretly observing the expressions of the soldiers, a little angry. However, he was also helpless. The soldiers of the Third Corps were already sick of the dishes they had prepared. Although the dishes they had meticulously prepared tasted good, and perhaps because they hadn't eaten them many times, the soldiers would still be excited and curious about them. However, if they were ordinary dishes, the soldiers wouldn't feel anything when they saw them. Without any new ideas, the taste wouldn't be able to capture the taste buds of the soldiers. This was the helplessness of the cooks. The commander of the Third Corps, Zhu Yu, slowly walked toward Wei Dafu with his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him were a few armored adjutants. Wei Dafu's face was immediately filled with respect. He bowed to Wei Dafu and stood to the side. Very good. You've worked hard. Distribute these dishes so that the soldiers can enjoy a good meal. Zhu Yu had a satisfied smile on his face. Although the Cook's Army unit's dishes were still the same, it wasn't easy to eat a good meal. Wei Dafu responded and then began to arrange for people to serve the dishes. The soldiers also rushed over and surrounded the pot. They excitedly began to order dishes. Wei Dafu and the others were very busy. These spirit qi dishes were very popular with the soldiers because they tasted good and could keep the true qi in their bodies full. How could they not like this kind of food? Bufang calmly looked at the group of soldiers who were like hungry wolves. He placed the small pot in his hand on the ground. The pot was still covered with a lid, so the smell of the dish could not be released at all. Just as Wei Dafu had said, the soldiers' gazes were all focused on the spirit energy dishes. No one was interested in Bufang's pot, which was an ordinary dish. Even the eyes of the soldiers did not land on the pot. The difference was too great. Wei Dafu had a smile on his face. From time to time, he would take a bowl of rice and serve it to the soldiers. From time to time, he would be in charge of patrolling. Looking at the bustling crowd, he could not stop smiling. His gaze fell on Bufang, who was standing in the corner. In front of Bufang was a pot. The pot was covered with a wooden lid, so the smell of the dish could not be released. Bufang stood alone in the corner, looking very shabby. See. Indeed, no one is interested. If no one eats your dish, I will settle the score with you when we return to the Cook's Army unit. Wei Dafu clasped his hands behind his back and walked to Bufang's side. Looking at Bufang's appearance, he suddenly sneered. The difference in competitiveness between ordinary dishes and spirit energy dishes was too great. There was no doubt about it. It could be seen from the intensity of the two dishes. Bufang glanced at Wei Dafu, who seemed to be a petty person intoxicated by success. The corners of his mouth curled up. He looked at the soldiers fighting over the dishes in the other pots, but his expression did not change. Even though the expressions on the soldiers' faces were very excited, Bufang could feel that there was not much joy in them. It was obvious they had already eaten these dishes. They were not looking forward to it. Moreover, the taste was not able to capture the excitement of their taste bud. Let them eat for a while longer. Otherwise, I'm afraid my dish will be snatched away. Bufang looked at Wei Dafu, who was about to leave with his hands behind his back, and said with a faint smile. His words were filled with confidence. Wei Dafu's body instantly stiffened. He sneered disdainfully. You brat, you are really confident. However, there is a huge difference between the food cooked with spirit energy ingredients and the food cooked with ordinary ingredients. Your confidence is just like your ignorance. Oh, ignorance? The corners of Bu Fang's mouth instantly curled up. Then, he no longer paid attention to Wei Dafu. Instead, he used one hand to press on the wooden lid of the pot. With a forceful pull, he suddenly lifted the lid. Steaming hot air soared into the sky. The rising white steam was like an exploding mushroom cloud, spreading out with a loud bang. An extremely rich fragrance gushed out from the pot. It was like a volcano that suddenly erupted. It was as if a bomb had been thrown into the camp. Golyalu, the fragrance was like a whirlwind. In an instant, the entire camp became silent. The movements of the soldiers fighting over the dishes all became sluggish. They smelled a very strange aroma. They had never smelled or appraised this aroma before, but this aroma stimulated their taste buds in an instant. The aroma was extremely rich. Bu Fang took in a deep breath. His face became slightly rosy. He looked at the dish in the pot with excitement. A spicy, numbing, rich, and fragrant smell gushed out from the pot and sprayed onto his face. Chunks of jelly-like tofu slightly trembled in the boiling soup. It was accompanied by a numbing and spicy fragrance. Mapo tofu. The fragrant and spicy mapo tofu. This was a very tasty dish. Just the fragrance alone was enough to make people swallow their saliva. The instant the wooden lid was lifted, the instant the fragrance gushed out, Wei Dafu's body stiffened. The fragrance that seemed to envelop the entire camp. What the hell? As expected, Wei Dafu secretly cursed in his heart. He raised his head and discovered that the soldiers, who were originally fighting over the spirit energy dishes, were all attracted over. This group of people slowly surrounded Bu Fang. Each and every one of them swallowed their saliva. Their faces were filled with excitement and desire. It smells so good. I have never smelled such a fragrant smell. What kind of dish is this? I have never eaten it before. Did the cook's army unit come up with a new dish? This spicy smell, this fragrance. Oh my God, my gluttonous bug is about to come out. I can't stand it anymore. The soldiers chattered among themselves. Their eyes lit up as they stared at the mapo tofu in front of Bu Fang. Their faces were filled with desire. This pot is so small. Could it be that this dish was made with ordinary ingredients? Some of the soldiers noticed that something was amiss. They were already familiar with the cook's army unit's routine. From the size of the pot, they could tell that it was a dish. A look of disappointment appeared on some of their faces. If it was just an ordinary dish, then their desire for it would be much weaker. Bu Fang was incomparably calm. If a dish wanted to attract people's attention, it must first rely on its fragrance. This was because fragrance was the first thing that the diners would come into contact with. It was the element that could stir the diners' hearts the most. The fragrance of the mapo tofu was absolutely fragrant. There were many dishes that were fragrant. However, since he wanted to improve the soldier's state of mind, spicy and fragrant dishes were the best. In the end, Bu Fang chose the mapo tofu. Although the quality of the ingredients used wasn't very good, the effects of the dish were pretty good. Bu Fang looked around at the soldiers who wanted to eat the mapo tofu but were regretfully shaking their heads. The corners of his mouth curled up. He picked up an iron ladle and shook the mapo tofu. He scooped up a spoonful and poured it into a bowl. Steam rose from the bowl and the fragrance of the mapo tofu wafted out. Bu Fang passed the bowl to the soldier closest to him and said calmly, "Have a taste." That soldier took the bowl subconsciously. It was obvious that he didn't want to reject Bu Fang's offer. Wei Dafu's eyes widened and he roared in his heart. "Why did you take it? Where is your moral integrity? If you want to maintain your state of mind, You must eat dishes cooked with spirit energy ingredients. The soldier eagerly looked at the bowl in his hand. The rosy, tender, and spicy mapo tofu not only tickled his taste buds, but it also attracted his vision. He used his trembling spoon to scoop up a spoonful of the tofu and blew on it. Then, under the gazes of the crowd, he poured the mapo tofu into his mouth. Chapter 288. The mapo tofu was mainly spicy, numb, refreshing, and fragrant. The moment the mapo tofu entered his mouth, the soldier's eyes immediately widened. He felt his scalp go numb in an instant, and all his hair seemed to be standing on end, while his pores opened wide. Oh my God! It was a different kind of feeling. It was as if 1,000 tiny hands were caressing his whole body. His mouth felt like it was filled with a fragrant balm. He lost all feeling in his lips, and his tongue felt like it was holding a piece of red-hot iron. This kind of feeling was simply indescribable. Gulp. He didn't even have the time to bite. As soon as he closed his mouth, that piece of mapo tofu, which was like a soldering iron, slid down his throat and into his stomach. It was as if his stomach had been set ablaze in an instant, and it emitted a sizzling sound. So spicy, but so refreshing. The soldier's eyes became moist. His lips were red and his nose was red. He felt as if he had fallen into a volcano, and his body was boiling. His body was burning with desire. The surrounding soldiers looked at the fellow who had eaten the mapo tofu. They were curious about the taste of the mapo tofu, because it was so fragrant that they couldn't stop eating it. Most of the delicacies in the Western Mystery City were spicy, and this kind of spicy delicacy made it impossible for them to resist. However, because this delicacy was made with ordinary ingredients, they were somewhat hesitant. If this mapo tofu was made with ingredients that contained rich spirit energy, they would have fought over it without any hesitation. This taste. Ugh! It's simply too refreshing. The soldier's mouth was numb, and he felt as if his tongue was tied up by the spiciness of the mapo tofu. The eyes of the surrounding soldiers suddenly lit up, and they swallowed their saliva. Then, they looked at the mapo tofu with the eyes of a hungry wolf. Who cared if it was a spirit energy delicacy or not? It looked so delicious. It would be a waste not to eat it. Give me a portion. I also want a portion. I love spicy delicacies the most. Hurry up. I'm dying of thirst. Clamorous voices rose and fell. The soldiers crowded in front of Bufang, and their faces were filled with excitement. After the first soldier tasted the mapo tofu, they finally couldn't endure it any longer. They could no longer resist the fragrance from before. Wei Dafu's expression immediately turned ugly. How could this group of people act like this? You're soldiers who are going to the battlefield. No matter how delicious this dish is, it's just an ordinary dish. It's not a spirit energy ingredient, so how can it improve your condition to the best? When they entered the battlefield, it was a matter of life and death. You can't do this. This is just a dish cooked with ordinary ingredients. Wei Dafu looked at the bustling soldiers and suddenly felt a little embarrassed, so he said, "Swish! Damn it! Awesome!" As soon as Wei Dafu's words left his mouth, one of the soldiers near him immediately swallowed a piece of mapo tofu. Before he could even savor the taste, he let out a loud roar. That roar was accompanied by the spicy sauce in his mouth, which splattered onto Wei Dafu's face. A spicy and numb taste instantly spread out on Wei Dafu's face. What the f***ck? Wei Dafu's tears almost flowed out. The spicy taste stimulated his skin, and he felt a burning sensation. He retreated to the side, and he used his hands to rub his face, trying to get rid of the burning sensation. However, when he raised his head once again, the scene in front of him caused his mouth to open wide, and he could no longer conceal the shock in his eyes. The soldiers' faces were filled with happiness. They squinted their eyes and breathed heavily. They held the bowl in their hands, licked their rosy lips, and beads of sweat seeped out of the tip of their noses. Wei Dafu had never seen such a happy expression on the faces of these soldiers. Even if it was a dish that he cooked, these soldiers only felt that they liked it, but they couldn't reveal a happy expression. Could it be that tofu was really that delicious? Wei Dafu couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. After all, Bufang's bowl was a little small, and in just a short while, the whole bowl of scalding mapo tofu was emptied. The soldiers who were high from eating the mapo tofu poured out the bottom of the bowl, and in the end, everything was swept clean. Bufang's bowl was surrounded by a large group of people, and the soldiers in the surroundings couldn't help but stretch out their heads to look at them. They were all curious as to what was going on here. When they saw the expressions of the soldiers, they were extremely shocked. There is actually something delicious here? What the F***ck? You bunch of bastards actually didn't invite us? F***ck. What do you mean? Did you finish eating? F***ck. You guys are crazy. How can you eat a dish made from ordinary ingredients with such relish? Do you guys want to die when you go to the battlefield? The entire camp immediately broke out into a heated discussion. However, the soldiers who had eaten Bufang's delicacies were immediately displeased. This was because they discovered a bone-chilling fact, and that was that they felt warm all over, as if they were filled with boundless energy. The true energy within their bodies flowed at a much faster speed than before. Their condition had actually reached its peak. It was as though they had eaten a spirit energy dish. It was inconceivable. The soldiers who had finished licking the bottom of the bowl looked at Bufang with sparkling eyes. In an instant, they became incomparably hot. Using ordinary ingredients, he was actually able to make such a delicious dish that could even improve one's condition. When did such an awesome chef appear in the cook's army unit? Wei Dafu clenched his teeth, and the cooks around him also furrowed their brows as they looked at Bufang. Because of Bufang's dish, all the soldiers were attracted to it, and the dishes that they had meticulously prepared were now ignored. Perhaps the people who were eating the dish didn't even pay attention to it, and they became somewhat absent-minded. The attitude of these soldiers was a disrespect to their culinary skills, and they were extremely unhappy. What are you doing? What are you doing? It's just a meal, and you guys are acting as though you're going to war? Am I being too lenient with you guys? Commander Zhu Yu immediately put on a stern face and walked over with his hands clasped behind his back. He furrowed his brows and looked at the noisy soldiers, who seemed to be in a market, and he scolded them in dissatisfaction. When the commander opened his mouth, the soldiers obediently quieted down, and they all chose other spirit energy dishes. Even the soldiers who had eaten the mapo tofu were the same. After all, there wasn't much mapo tofu to begin with, and they had only tasted it. It was impossible for them to eat until they were full. However, after eating the mapo tofu, the complexions of the soldiers who had eaten the spirit energy dishes became somewhat unsightly, and they looked as though they were chewing wax. Bah! What is this thing? It's so disgusting. Is this food meant to be fed to pigs? It's so disgusting. This spiciness is just like plain water. Have the cook's culinary skills become so weak? The dishes are getting more and more disgusting. After the soldiers ate a mouthful of the spirit energy dishes, they couldn't help but start muttering. Although their voices weren't loud, the cooks of the cook's army unit heard them. Wei Dafu was so angry that his face became somewhat crooked. He had already cooked so meticulously, but in return, he was criticized for what? Why are you guys so arrogant? Was it because they ate a bowl of mapo tofu? Wei Dafu wasn't the only one who felt this way. The complexions of the cooks didn't look too good. They all thought of the reason, and they all looked at Bufang with unkind gazes. Bufang didn't panic at all, and he didn't care about the vicious gazes of the people around him. The dishes I made were delicious. Are you blaming me? Why don't you want to eat? If you don't want to eat, then quickly pack up and prepare to set off. Zhu Yu said coldly as he ate a mouthful of rice and swept his gaze over the soldiers, whose faces were filled with disdain. After the commander spoke, the soldiers unwillingly started eating. After all, on the battlefield, people were like iron and food was like steel. If they didn't eat their fill, they would all die. Wei Dafu's chest heaved up and down violently, and the faces of the cooks around him trembled as they walked over. The cooks who cooked the dishes were all experienced cooks in the Cook's Army unit. Now that they were humiliated, they were somewhat dissatisfied with Bufang. A group of people surrounded him, and they actually formed a formless pressure. They wanted to make Bufang bow his head. They wanted to let Bufang know what it meant to respect his seniors. He was just a newbie, and he wanted to ascend to the heavens. Chapter 289. Bufang calmly put away the pot on the ground and slowly covered it with a wooden lid. He paid no attention to the cold gazes of the cooks around him. This group of cooks was furious. The dish that so many of them had painstakingly cooked was actually suppressed by a dish made from ordinary ingredients by a kid in front of them. This was simply a slap to their faces. However, they couldn't make things difficult for him at this moment. After all, they were still in the military camp and Commander Zhu was not far away. If they wanted to deal with Bufang, they would have to wait until they returned to the Cook's Army unit's camp. Thus, all the cooks coldly snorted and looked at Bufang with malicious gazes. Wei Dafu was shocked in his heart. However, this shock only lasted for a moment before it was replaced by coldness. The tallest tree in the forest would be destroyed by the wind. This was a very reasonable saying. The brilliance displayed by Bufang had already caused many people to fear him. In the future, in the Cook's Army unit, Bufang's life would become more and more difficult. It might even reach the point where it would be difficult for him to move an inch. However, to Bufang, this was not the slightest bit of interest. Knitting his brows, Bufang ignored those sharp gazes. He picked up the pot and walked out of the military camp. Since his dish had already been eaten, he had a reason to return to his tent. Wei Dafu felt a burning pain on his face. Previously, he had said that if no one ate Bufang's dish, he would severely punish Bufang when he returned. However, the result was such a sharp slap to his face. Not only did Bufang's dish get eaten, but it was also the first dish that was snatched up. Comparing oneself to others would always inadvertently infuriate others to death. That kid's dish. Is it really that delicious? Wei Dafu's heart was somewhat shaken. Bufang carried the pot back to his camp. He stretched his waist and sat cross-legged on his bed. Looking at the other ordinary ingredients that did not contain any spirit energy, he couldn't help but furrow his brows. He was imagining how he would cook his next dish. While he was thinking about these things, the mealtime in the military camp had also ended. The Cook's Army unit had all returned. The atmosphere in the camp suddenly became a little awkward. Long Kai was the latest person to come to Bufang's camp. He had kindly come to remind Bufang that Bufang's dish was really in the limelight this time, causing many old cook skills to be neglected. Now, they might come to find trouble with Bufang. However, Bufang's reaction made Long Kai speechless. That was because Bufang was not worried at all. He was still sitting cross-legged on the bed, not panicking at all. A group of people swarmed over, and Wei Dafu also followed behind them with his hands clasped behind his back. They all squeezed into the tent where Bufang was. What kind of smell is this? The smell of mold. What kind of delicious dish can be made in such a broken place? Tsk, tsk, tsk. Look, these vegetables seem to be rotten, and the stench is so strong. There is actually someone who dares to use this kind of ingredient to cook. Simply shameless. Where's your moral integrity? What if the soldiers' stomachs are spoiled by a dish made in such a dirty and messy environment? This group of people squeezed into Bufang's tent and started to chatter incessantly, trying to find fault with Bufang. They all disliked Bufang. Bufang was a newcomer, a junior. However, their culinary skills were crushed by a junior. This made all of their faces somewhat ugly. Long Kai was a little angry, but he was also a little helpless. Although he was young, he had been in the cook's army unit for a long time. He had long heard about the attitude of these cooks, who took advantage of their seniority. However, this was the first time he had seen it for himself. He felt a little disgusted. The faces of these people gave him goosebumps. Bufang was staying in a camp where ordinary ingredients were piled up. Ordinary ingredients lacked spirit energy, so their preservation was naturally much worse than those with spirit energy. It was normal for them to rot. Why did these people come here to act like they were pretentious? Was it because the dishes cooked by Bufang were accepted by most of the soldiers? It was easy for a person's mentality to be unbalanced. Once their mentality was unbalanced, they would do all kinds of disgusting things. Bufang indifferently swept his gaze over this group of people. There was not the slightest fluctuation of emotions in his eyes. He just looked at them indifferently. Looking at them, the group of cooks who were chattering non-stop couldn't help but shut their mouths and look at Bufang. Bufang's imposing manner was indescribably strong, and it made them cower a little. Wei Dafu walked out of the crowd and stood in front of them. He looked at Bufang in a bad mood. "Brat, I admit that your culinary skills are very strong. However, you can't be too arrogant here. This will make us feel uncomfortable. If we feel uncomfortable, then don't even think about feeling comfortable. Do you understand?" Wei Dafu said. "What does your discomfort have to do with me? The purpose of a chef is to cook delicacies that can make people happy, not to cook delicacies that can please you. Moreover, who do you think you are? Why should I care whether you feel comfortable or not?" Bufang expressionlessly said. This was the first time he encountered such an unreasonable group of people. He only cooked a delicious dish that attracted the attention of the soldiers and became the most popular dish. Yet, this group of jealous people wanted to suppress him? Was the imperial city's black-hearted owner Bu that easy to suppress? Now, except for Long Kai, the rest of you should get out of my camp. Otherwise, Bufang let out a sigh of relief. Xiao Bai, who was standing in the corner of the tent, had his mechanical eyes flicker with a red light. He glanced at the group of cooks who had malicious intentions on their faces. "Damn it! This brat is really too arrogant. I can't stand it. I want to kill him." A burly man wearing a linen military uniform and an apron walked out from the crowd. He was the strongest among the cooks. Although his culinary skills weren't the best, his physique and cultivation were the strongest. This person walked in front of Bufang and slapped the table in the tent, almost breaking it into pieces. Since someone had stepped out, the others also clamored with righteous indignation. They all glared at Bufang. Why should the dishes they cooked with great effort be suppressed by this brat's dish that wasn't made of spirit energy ingredients? That kind of trash dish. What right did he have to suppress their dishes? Long Kai's young and tender face became somewhat pale. He looked at the group of people who had become aggressive with fear, and he shrunk back towards Bufang's location. At this moment, Bufang and Long Kai were like passengers on a small boat that was floating in the wind and wave. The anger of the cooks was like a vast ocean. When the waves rolled over, they wanted to overturn their small boat and completely suppress Bufang. "I've said it before. Don't cause trouble in my tent. Otherwise, don't blame me for being impolite." Bufang stood up from his bed and his tone became somewhat impolite. The burly cook glared at him and took a step forward. He reached out his hand to grab Bufang's collar. This kind of newcomer who didn't know how to respect others should be taught a good lesson. He actually dared to steal the limelight of his seniors. Bufang was stunned. He raised his slender palm and lightly patted the burly cook's palm. Instantly, the burly cook's palm was slapped away. With a crisp slap, the burly cook felt as though his palm had become swollen. Intense pain continuously surged out, causing him to break out in a cold sweat. "Xiao Bai! Strip this group of troublemakers and throw them out, Bufang calmly said. Then, 2 red lights shone behind Bufang. Xiao Bai's clone appeared. As the red lights flickered, it looked at the surrounding cooks. Humph! Trying to act mysterious. Is a mere broken puppet the reason for you to be so arrogant? Wei Dafu disdainfully snorted. Xiao Bai was very ordinary. Wei Dafu had been in the cook's army unit for many years and had seen many puppets like Xiao Bai. Because they had to come into contact with many new sects, there was a type of sect that specialized in producing puppets, just like the one beside Bufang. However, this kind of puppet didn't have much lethality, so Wei Dafu wasn't worried at all. However, what made Wei Dafu feel astonished was that just as his voice faded away, the sound of clothes being torn resounded in the air. Rip! A crisp sound rang out. Then, a white silhouette flew out. The sound of a heavy object landing on the ground resounded outside the door. Everyone was stunned. Then, they turned their heads to look outside the tent. There was a burly man whose clothes had been stripped off. He covered his lower body and trembled as he stood up. Bufang calmly raised the corners of his mouth. Patting Xiao Bai's plump belly, he climbed back onto his bed and sat cross-legged. His gaze was still as calm as a leisurely cloud. Chapter 290. You! How dare you! Wei Dafu looked at the burly man who was stripped naked and thrown out of the tent. His heart trembled and his face revealed a look of disbelief. How could he dare to throw him out? What right did he have to throw him out? It was the first time he met such an unreasonable newcomer. It was the first time he met such an arrogant newcomer. Wei Dafu was furious. He felt like he had been slapped in the face. The iron lump brought by Bufang did not care about his feelings at all. The burly man fell outside the tent and stood up shakily. His face was a mix of green and red. He was so depressed that he almost vomited blood. What the hell? He actually stripped someone? Was there a need to be so insane? You brat. Just you wait. The burly man looked at Bufang, who was sitting cross-legged on the bed. He wanted to spit out some harsh words, but he felt a red light sweeping toward him. His buttocks trembled and he looked at the iron lump in fear. Even though he was a chef from the cook's army unit, he still had some cultivation. He was a soldier who could fight on the battlefield with a knife and a spear. However, when faced with the iron lump, he did not even know what happened. He was stripped naked and thrown out of the tent. Being stripped naked was not scary. The important thing was that he did not even know how he was stripped naked. The tent was silent for a moment. Then, a series of questioning voices rang out. The faces of the cook's army unit were filled with anger. This newcomer actually dared to fight back? Did he really think that he could cook a few delicious dishes and become complacent? He actually dared to attack an old man. Brat, are you courting death? You actually dared to attack us seniors? Humph. A newcomer is a newcomer. He actually dared to attack us. Do he want to chop firewood for the rest of his life? This arrogant newcomer needs to be taught a lesson. Otherwise, he will never know how to respect his seniors. The incessant questioning voices resounded in the tent. Bufang could not help but open his eyes. He frowned and revealed a trace of annoyance. If you are so noisy, strip and throw them out, Bufang said indifferently. His voice was extremely cold and he wasn't polite to these people at all. Someone was amused by Bufang. This brat's tone was too arrogant, wasn't it? Does he really think that there's no one here who can deal with him? A fierce look appeared on their faces. With a roar, they charged toward Bufang. However, they soon discovered that something was amiss. They felt as though they were riding on the clouds, and they were thrown into the air. Their figures drew a beautiful arc in the air, and the scenery in front of them, which was supposed to be moving forward, was actually moving backward. Bang! A series of heavy objects fell on the ground. The 2 men who intended to deal with Bufang were also stripped and thrown out of the tent. Another 2 naked figures climbed up from the ground awkwardly. Wei Dafu's expression slightly froze. "How dare you?" Just as he was about to question him, he discovered that the red-eyed lump of metal had unknowingly appeared in front of him. It grabbed him by the collar and threw him away. His body spun in the air, and his clothes were stripped as he spun in the air. "I've been stripped naked. Damn it." Bang. Wei Dafu was dumbfounded. He was dumbfounded from the beginning until the end. Only when he fell to the ground and felt an intense pain did he realize that he had been stripped and thrown out of the tent. Everyone in the tent was chattering and cursing at this moment. They were like drakes whose throats had been grabbed. Their eyes widened and their faces were filled with shock. Wei Dafu, Captain Wei, the person with the highest qualifications in the cook's army unit, the person with the best culinary skills, was actually thrown out by Bu Fang's iron puppet. Moreover, he was also stripped. Everyone's body trembled. Long Kai's eyes were filled with excitement. Wei Dafu crawled up from the ground and covered his crotch. He was flustered and exasperated, and his eyes were filled with resentment. "Stinking brat! You have guts. From today onwards, you will obediently stay in this ordinary ingredients camp. Don't even think of touching a single spirit energy ingredient." "Long Kai, what are you laughing at? Do you also want to stay in this ordinary ingredients camp?" Wei Dafu was so angry that he stomped his feet. However, he didn't dare to make any big movements, so he looked quite comical. Long Kai wanted to laugh but didn't dare to. Scram! Bu Fang opened his eyes, which were filled with impatience. Ever since he joined the cook's army unit, Wei Dafu had been constantly going against him. Bu Fang was a little confused. What was this guy trying to do? However, it wasn't important anymore. Bu Fang was a little impatient and didn't give him any face. The group of people in the tent retreated like a receding tide. They knew that they couldn't use force to deal with Bu Fang because that iron puppet was too strong. However, if force didn't work, then they would isolate him and isolate him. Everyone was ordered not to have any contact with Bu Fang, to be isolated from the army. This was a very scary thing for many people. However, it didn't matter to Bu Fang. Long Kai gave Bu Fang a worried look before leaving the tent. Very quickly, the atmosphere in the tent became cold and cheerless. Dang dang dang! The sound of a wok being knocked resounded. Then, Wei Dafu's ice-cold voice spread throughout the entire camp. "Let's move out. Hurry up and gather for me. Carry your equipment and bring your tools. We are leaving." Rustling, rustling, a messy but somewhat orderly voice rang out. Then, one figure after another came out of the tent. These people all carried a black iron wok on their back and lined up in the camp. In the beginning, they asked Bu Fang to carry the wok, but Bu Fang refused. He could totally store this black wok into the system's storage space. However, because of this training mission, the system's storage space seemed to have been sealed. It didn't allow him to use the ingredients in the system's storage space. This was a headache for Bu Fang. Therefore, he could only follow the cook's army unit and carry the wok out of the tent. They gathered in the camp and lined up. When the cook's army unit set out, because they were in charge of cooking, they carried the black wok with them. When they set up camp, they directly set up a stove and cooked on the spot. Wei Dafu also carried a wok on his back. His expression was grim as he scanned the crowd. When he saw Bu Fang carrying the same wok, his expression darkened and he snorted. With the sound of a bugle horn, the cook's army unit also carried the black wok and pushed the baggage out of the camp. They met up with the 3rd Corps of the Western Mystery Army and headed out of the Western Mystery City. This time, not only the 3rd Corps of the Western Mystery Army, but also the main force of the Western Mystery Army, the 2nd Corps, left the Western Mystery City and headed to the nearest big city to provide support. This was because the Western Mystery City had received a request for help from other big cities. In the letter, the enemy was described to be extremely terrifying, and 2 of the Western Mystery Army had been dispatched. After all, the Western Mystery City was the largest city in the Northwest, and it was also one of the three great ancient cities. They had to uphold the order of the Light Wind Empire in the Northwest. It was their responsibility to wipe out the enemy. On the vast plains, a long and narrow army was marching slowly. This army was divided into a long line, and each position was occupied by a different soldier. The Cook's army unit was at the back of the army, carrying the Black Walk on their backs as they advanced with difficulty. The scorching sun bloomed in the sky, sprinkling its scorching rays down. The whole plain seemed to be evaporating from the heat. Many people felt the scorching heat and found it unbearable. Bufang carried the walk, while Xiao Bai followed behind him. He was a little far away from the army. Due to the incident the day before, the Cook's army unit, except for Dragon Fang, did not interact with Bufang and completely isolated him. They wanted to take revenge on Bufang and drive Bufang crazy in the Cook's army unit. Every time Long Kai chatted with Bufang, he would be glared at by Wei Dafu. Then, Long Kai would run away dejectedly. Only Wei Dafu was left behind, looking at Bufang with a sneer. Bufang felt that this Wei Dafu was a lunatic. Creak, creak. The wheels of the carriages loaded with supplies made heavy sounds as they moved along the road. However, the army was still marching forward. When the pitch-black curtain of night hung high in the sky, two crescent moons mischievously poked their heads out. With a command, the soldiers stopped moving forward and began to set up camp. The Cook's army unit began to get busy. They quickly set up the tents, set up the walk racks, and began to cook. Bufang was at the back. Watching the Cook's army unit quickly set up the tents and the walk racks, a trace of astonishment appeared on his face. These people were worthy of being the Cook's army unit. They were experienced, and it was easy for them to do such things. Bufang also set up the tent, set up the walk racks, and prepared to cook. However, when the Cook's army unit began to cook and smoke curled up from the chimneys, the other soldiers were resting and conserving their energy. Along with the rustling of the surrounding bushes, there seemed to be some sounds coming from the surrounding bushes. This caused the surrounding soldiers to panic. One of the soldiers went forward to investigate, and just as he pushed aside the bushes, a figure appeared in front of him. A ferocious wolf howl resounded. Then, a huge figure pounced forward and bit the soldier who was investigating. Chapter 291. Above the vast northwest plains, a sharp sword light flowed. Then, with a speed as swift as a clap of thunder, it flew out at an extremely fast speed. With a clattering sound, the beam of light from the sword dissipated, revealing a figure on a sword. This figure had sword-like eyebrows and bright eyes. His eyes were as bright as the stars. He hovered in the air on his sword and squinted his eyes as he gazed at the boundless northwest plains. "We're almost at the Western Mystery City. The Great Elder arranged for me to come to the aid of the Western Mystery City. Could it be that such a terrible thing will happen in the Western Mystery City? The reappearance of the Shura sect is really unexpected." Tang Yin's white robe fluttered in the wind as he gazed into the distance. Then, with a flash of light from his sword, he continued to fly forward. The Light Wind Empire was in chaos. Countless cities were embroiled in war. The bloody war had caused the deaths of countless soldiers. The sky was overflowing with resentment. As a major sect in the southern region, the Celestial Arcanum sect in Wuliang Mountain could not sit idly by. Moreover, an elder from the godly temple of the Wildlands had fallen in the Light Wind Empire. This was a shocking news to the godly temple of the Wildlands. That elder had a supreme being physical body and an extremely powerful cultivation level. He was a half-step supreme being. Since such an expert had fallen in the Light Wind Empire, how could the godly temple of the Wildlands not pay attention to it? The godly temple of the Wildlands sent people to investigate and discovered that the Light Wind Empire had fallen into internal strife. This internal strife seemed to be orchestrated by someone. When they discovered this, they were ambushed. Several of the 7th grade battle saints from the godly temple of the Wildlands were killed in the ambush. Only a few of them managed to escape in a sorry state. However, because they managed to escape, they managed to bring back the shocking news. The Shura sect, which had been annihilated 1,000 years ago, had reappeared and even led a war against the Light Wind Empire. Although no one knew what they were plotting, with the evil nature of the Shura sect, they were definitely up to no good. All the major powers in the southern region had received the news from the godly temple of the Wildlands. Therefore, they sent their powerful disciples to assist the Light Wind Empire. King Yu's forces had the help of the Shura sect, while the other major powers sent their experts to assist the Light Wind Empire's emperor. For a moment, the two sides were evenly matched. "It's a ground wolf!" With a cry of alarm, the soldiers of the Western Mystery Army's 3rd Corps roared and surrounded the giant wolf that had rushed out of the ground. This kind of ground wolf lived underground and moved very fast. To them, the earth was like water to fish. It was a very rare type of Northwest spirit beast. They were rank 4 spirit beast. Their fighting strength was not strong, but they could always surprise people and injure them. Furthermore, the bite force of this ground wolf was very strong. Once bitten, at least blood would be seen. For example, the soldier who was bitten almost had his entire arm dislocated. Fresh blood gushed out. After all, they were well-trained soldiers. They raised their weapons and stabbed at the ground wolves that were rushing out from the ground. For a moment, battle cries filled the entire army. As the commander of the 3rd Corps, Zhu Yu's expression was very ugly. They had only just set off, but they had already encountered such a troublesome spirit beast. It could be said that they were at a disadvantage. The ground wolves were quickly beaten back by the soldiers. One by one, they burrowed back into the ground. However, the soldiers became tense, and they could no longer relax. Ground wolf. Bufang's eyes slightly lit up. He looked at the ground wolf that was stabbed to death by the soldiers and began to study it with great interest. The other soldiers of the cook's army unit were busy protecting the supplies, so they did not notice him. The meat quality of this ground wolf was not bad. After Bufang flipped the body of the ground wolf, his eyes slightly narrowed. The meat of these underground wolves had been washed by the underground spirit energy, so it had a special feeling. Bufang raised his hand and patted the body of the ground wolf. He stood up and sighed regretfully. He could not use the system dimensional bag. Otherwise, he would have stored the body of the ground wolf in it. Although the grade of this ingredient was low, the meat quality was not bad. It should taste good when cooked. The ground wolves were beaten back, but the 3rd Corps was panicking. Although they managed to repel the ground wolves, many soldiers were injured. The camp was filled with mournful cries. This kind of unpredictable spirit beast was the hardest to control. However, no matter what, the march had to continue. The next day, the Western Mystery Army continued forward. However, this time they encountered spirit beasts again. When they passed by a pile of rugged rocks, the usually lazy 4th grade wind speech snakes went berserk and attacked the soldiers. Many of the soldiers were seriously injured. Although the venom of these wind speech snakes was not strong, a bite from them would still make them weak for 3 to 5 days. They were also a type of spirit beast that gave people headache. This time, the spirit beasts went berserk, causing the morale of the Western Mystery Army to drop a few notches. The commander of the 3rd Corps, Zhu Yu, had a bad feeling. These spirit beasts attacked the army for no reason. There was definitely something wrong. He had marched many times, and it was not the first time he encountered these spirit beasts. However, he had never seen a spirit beast that attacked the army first. However, he could not figure out what the problem was, so the army could only continue forward. However, after this, the 3rd Corps was attacked by several groups of spirit beasts. These spirit beasts were not of high grade, but there were many of them, and they were very difficult to deal with. The morale of the Western Mystery Army was completely depressed. The soldiers were all complaining and listless. On top of a lush mountain, a military flag was fluttering in the wind. Soldiers riding on spirit beasts were standing in a line. Among these soldiers, there was a sinister man wrapped in a black robe. The surrounding soldiers were very respectful toward this black-robed man. Senior Amni, if nothing unexpected happens, the Western Mystery Army will soon arrive at Mo Luo City. At that time, with Mo Luo City and the support of the Western Mystery Army, we will be in a very passive position, a general-looking soldier said with a frown. General Mo Lin, you are a general under King Yu's command. You have to relax. The Western Mystery Army will definitely have a pleasant surprise when they arrive here from the Western Mystery City. I have prepared many gifts for them. When they arrive at the foot of this cliff, the Western Mystery Army will be annihilated, the black-robed old man said with a sinister smile. Mo Lin's heart suddenly shuddered. He did not dare to be negligent. This black-robed old man was an expert with a cultivation level of 7th grade. With him overseeing the army, they should have been able to quickly conquer Mo Luo City. However, the sudden appearance of a 7th grade battle saint slowed down their attack. Only by conquering Mo Luo City would they be able to press on and attack the largest city in the northwest, the Western Mystery City. The Western Mystery City was obviously aware of the urgency of the situation, so they sent their army to support them. Report. The scouts at the front have reported that the 3rd Corps of the Western Mystery Army has already entered the vicinity of the cliff. Just as General Mo Lin and the black-robed elder were chatting, a scout quickly came to report. In an instant, Mo Lin and the elder's eyes lit up. Then, they mounted their horses and galloped forward, leading the soldiers in a mad dash. The 3rd Corps of the Western Mystery Army was currently in low spirit. After inexplicably experiencing so many spirit beasts' attacks, the soldiers' minds and bodies were greatly damaged. At this moment they were in a very bad state. Zhu Yu also knew that the situation was troublesome, so he ordered them to set up camp. The 3rd Corps was already in a state of panic, and had sent out many scouts to investigate. If there were more spirit beasts attacking, they would be able to prepare for it. We will reach Mo Luo City soon. Pass down the order. Let the cook's army unit prepare a good meal and raise everyone's mental state to its peak. Zhu Yu roared loudly. Then, the cook's army unit received the military order. Although Wei Dafu and the others were a little tired, they still had to keep their spirits up. This meal would affect their state of mind for the upcoming battle. Swoosh! A powerful arrow sped through the air. The sound of the bowstring snapping was like thunder. A scout who was scouting was instantly pierced through the head by the arrow. Blood splattered everywhere. Numerous arrows were shot out, and in an instant, the scouts were all killed by the rain of arrows. However, under this terrifying attack, a scout was drenched in blood. He quickly rode his horse toward the Western Mystery Army. There was an ambush here. The scout's heart trembled. After receiving the order, he started cooking. Bu Fong was also unhurriedly setting up a pot rack and starting a fire. After a while, smoke curled up from the kitchen. He was only in charge of cooking ordinary ingredients, so naturally, he didn't have to put in much effort. Zhu Yu stood in front of the camp, his brows tightly furrowed. Suddenly, his pupils shrank. In the distance, he saw a scout whose body was dripping with blood. The scout was riding a horse and rushing back. Chapter 292. Rumble. Steam rose from the wok, rising into the night and then dissipating in the air. Bu Fong opened the lid of the wok, and the fragrance within the wok spread out. This time, he was cooking a sour and spicy soup. Although Bu Fong didn't really care about it, there were only a few ingredients prepared for him in this cooking position, and there were only a few. Within the boiling hot sour and spicy soup, chunks of potatoes were rolling around and the black and white mushrooms were bubbling up and down. The flame under the wok was still burning, but the soup was already cooked. He didn't extinguish the fire and just scooped a bowl of soup for himself. He walked to the side and took a sip. In the distance, the other members of the cook's army unit were also cooking diligently. They weren't in a good state at the moment. After rushing for an entire day, they were all on tenterhooks. Their nerves had been tense at the beginning, and they were now relaxed. As Bufang drank the delicious sour and spicy soup, he felt a warm energy flowing through his body. The night in the northwest plains was very cold and the temperature had dropped drastically. After drinking this bowl of soup, he felt extremely comfortable. Long Kai dragged his exhausted body to Bufang's side. His nose twitched and he smelled the boiling hot sour and spicy soup in the wok. His eyes instantly lit up. He scooped a portion of the soup and sat beside Bufang. He breathed in and drank the soup. The dishes of the cook's army unit were also ready and were distributed to the soldiers who had set up camp. The ingredients they used contained spirit energy, and after drinking it, one would feel full of energy. This was also the reason why the cook's army unit existed in the army. Zhu Yu's eyes widened as he stared at the scout who had arrived in front of him, but was now covered in blood and had collapsed in front of him. Zhu Yu's heart trembled as he lifted his head and looked at the pitch-black distance. That place seemed to have turned into the mouth of a demon. "Damn it! There's an ambush!" Zhu Yu bellowed. His voice was wrapped with true energy and spread out. This caused the soldiers who were eating the food cooked by the cook's army unit to tense up. They stood up from their seats and quickly gathered together. 1 ray, 2 rays, then, spirit beasts with scarlet eyes dashed out from the darkness. They charged toward the Western Mystery Army with a tyrannical and ruthless aura. Zhu Yu led his soldiers and took the lead to kill these spirit beasts. "It's those crazy spiritual beasts again. Damn it! What the hell is going on?" Zhu Yu was infuriated, and his movements became even more ferocious. With every slash of his sword, a spirit beast's head would be chopped off. These spirit beasts' cultivations were not strong. But they couldn't rely on numbers. All of a sudden, Zhu Yu seemed to hear the sound of a bowstring being pulled. An arrow filled with boundless energy shot out from the darkness. Its speed was extremely fast, as though it wanted to tear through the air, instantly piercing through Zhu Yu's head. At the critical moment, Zhu Yu roared and blocked the arrow. "Arrows! There's an enemy!" Zhu Yu's heart trembled. Then, from the darkness, came a series of blood-curdling screams. That enemy actually dashed out at this moment. This was the moment when the soldiers were the most relaxed. This was the moment when the soldiers were tormented by the spirit beasts. Zhu Yu didn't dare to imagine the consequences of this enemy's attack. The hooves of the spirit beasts stomped on the ground, causing the ground to shake violently. Numerous armored soldiers charged out from the darkness. Their battle cries were accompanied by the waving of their flags, which resounded throughout the entire valley. The Third Corps of the Western Mystery Army finally clashed with this group of enemies who had suddenly attacked them. Zhu Yu's killing intent surged. Sure enough, this group of people was behind all this. All the spirit beasts they encountered along the way were definitely controlled by this group of people. Zhu Yu had always been sullen, and at this moment, all of his accumulated grievances were released. Although he was exhausted, he didn't hesitate to kill the enemies. The battle broke out in an instant. In an instant, blood flowed like a river. Fresh blood splattered everywhere, and a thick stench of blood permeated the entire valley. Bufang and Long Kai were drinking their sour spicy soup when they suddenly felt the ground shake. A battle actually broke out in front of them without any warning. The sound of blades colliding resounded incessantly. "Is this a battle?" Long Kai was alarmed. "It should be." Bufang drank a mouthful of the sour spicy soup, and his eyes flickered with uncertainty. The Western Mystery Army had experienced numerous spirit beasts attacks, and their morale was already low. How could they be a match for this group of enemies? It seemed like the Western Mystery Army was in danger. Mo Lin held his long spear, and his face was filled with excitement. Although this army was the weakest of the Western Mystery Army, if they could kill this army, It would still be a great achievement. With a sweep of his spear, a soldier was cleaved in half. Hot blood splattered everywhere, and Mo Lin was extremely excited. On the top of the cliff, the eyes of the black-robed elder flickered, and he muttered some incantations. He actually began to draw a magic array. The magic array was very complicated and strange. Although it was complicated, it didn't take too much time to draw. When the magic array was formed, 5 blood-colored jade talismans floated up and formed the magic array. Suddenly, a suction force burst out from the magic array. Then, accompanied by the battle cries from the valley, a white and gray energy was released from the magic array. The white and gray energy was actually a blurry figure. Some were struggling and roaring, and some were wantonly roaring. These were the soul essences of the soldiers who had died in battle. These souls carried the anger and unwillingness of these soldiers before they died, and their resentment was extremely heavy. Ha ha! Kill, kill, the more the better! The Shura sect warrior wrapped in a black robe was extremely excited, and he couldn't help but laugh loudly. Suddenly, his laughter came to an abrupt end. He looked into the distance and saw that in the dark sky, a sharp sword light was rapidly approaching. Shura sect demon, come out and meet your death. The sword light dissipated in the void, then turned into a sky full of sword rain, pouring down and killing the enemies in a small area. Tang Yin's eyebrows were like swords, and his eyes were like stars. He walked in the air, and a long sword rotated in the void, then he held it in his hand. Being able to walk in the air meant that he had already stepped into the realm of 7th grade battle saint. His cultivation level was advancing very quickly. With Tang Yin's participation, the Western Mystery Army's morale was immediately boosted, and they actually began to counterattack. Mo Lin solemnly looked at Tang Yin, who was floating in the void. In the past, battle saints were rarely seen, but now there was an endless stream of them. This was an unprecedented war for the Light Wind Empire. Damn it, it's those people from the Celestial Arcanum sect again. Is it those forces from the southern region again? They want to stop the rise of our Shura sect again? Dream on. All of you die. The eyes of the elder shrouded in a black robe suddenly burst forth with a bloody glow. Then, his figure burst forth and actually stepped on the air as well. He swung his claw toward Tang Yin, who was floating in the air. This claw was ferocious and turned into a bloody glow that circulated around it. Tang Yin was not the least bit afraid. He also raised his sword and began to fight with the elder. The battle was very fierce. The whole valley seemed to be soaked in blood, and it sent chills down people's spines. Bu Fong puzzledly looked at Tang Yin, who was holding a sword and fighting in the sky. His eyebrows suddenly twitched. He didn't expect to meet an old friend here. However, looking at Tang Yin's condition, it seemed that he couldn't defeat the black-robed elder. After all, Tang Yin broke through too late. The battle lasted from night until dawn. Tang Yin's condition wasn't good, and he was sent flying back with a pale face. Zhu Yu also shouted for retreat, so the Western Mystery Army finally chose to retreat from the valley. The army retreated one after another, and the cook's army unit escorted the rations as they retreated. In the void, the black-robed elder's eyes flickered with an ominous glint, and he shouted, "Chase after them! Kill them all! Retreat!" How could he let such a fat piece of meat escape from his mouth? If he could annihilate this Western Mystery Army, he would have accomplished half of the task given to him by the High Priestess. At that time, when he conquered Mo Luo City, he would have collected enough spiritual essences and souls, which would be one step closer to the rise of the Shura sect. Therefore, he didn't want the Western Mystery Army to retreat. He had fought a few battles with the Celestial Arcanum sect's experts, and they were no match for him. Therefore, he wasn't afraid. Mo Lin's eyes were filled with excitement. He brandished his weapon and chased after the Western Mystery Army while shouting. He didn't want to give up this opportunity to gain merit. Tang Yin was enraged. This Shura sect devil wanted a foot after being given an inch? The Western Mystery Army, which was forced into a desperate situation, once again engaged in a fierce battle with the enemy. Therefore, another battle broke out outside the valley. However, this time, Tang Yin was heavily injured in exchange for the retreat of the Western Mystery Army's Third Corps. The Western Mystery Army's Third Corps, which had set up camp in a different place, was in a miserable state. They had also lost about half of their rations during the emergency retreat. With their rations running low, Wei Dafu could only look for Bufang with a gloomy face. He didn't have many spirit energy ingredients left, so he could only use ordinary ingredients to make up for it. Wei Dafu felt his face burning with pain, but this time, Bufang didn't want to talk nonsense with him, so he directly agreed to cook. Long Kai stayed by Bufang's side as his assistant. After Wei Dafu left, the two of them started to prepare to cook a large wok of dishes that could support many people. This was also Bufang's first time cooking such a large wok of dishes. Chapter 293. In the rocky campsite, the shadows of tents overlapped, and the cooking fire rose in spirals. Under the radiance of dawn, it seemed somewhat lonely. Inside the tent, Tang Yin sat cross-legged with a pale face. The true energy around his body fluctuated and constantly surged, healing his internal injuries. Even though he had just broken through to 7th grade battle saint, he was still not a match for the warrior of the Shura sect. After a long while, the true energy was stirred and returned to his body. Then, Tang Yin spat out a mouthful of blood, and his face became even paler. I didn't expect the cultivation level of the Shura sect to be so strong. Tang Yin's face was pale as a trace of worry surfaced in his eyes. If he couldn't stop the Shura sect warrior, the entire Mo Luo city, or even the Western Mystery City, would fall into the hands of those demons. At that time, rivers of blood would flow. He didn't know much about the Shura sect, but Anai Yen had told him some things about the Shura sect. This sect had stepped into the southern region from the outside 1,000 years ago. At that time, it was a disaster for the southern region. This was because if one wanted to cultivate the Shura sect's cultivation method to the peak, they needed countless spiritual essences and souls, and the acquisition of spiritual essences and souls could only be obtained through slaughter. At that time, the Shura sect master was extremely powerful and dominated the southern region. The Celestial Arcanum sect of the Wuliang Mountain, the Clear Sky Pagoda of the 100,000 Mountains, the Godly Temple of the Wildlands, the White Cloud Villa of the Illusory Spirit Swamp, and other forces had to join forces to eliminate the Shura sect that had plagued the southern region. No one would have thought that this terrifying force would be revived. Moreover, from their actions, there was no doubt that they were doing this for their cultivation. To instigate a war, absorb so many spiritual essences and souls, and cause countless lives to be lost, was just for their cultivation. This was simply too cruel. The Shura sect has been keeping a low profile these days. They only instigated a war between the empires, but war is also the most dangerous thing to do. After a war, the amount of spiritual essences and souls they collected will definitely be considerable. Perhaps they also wanted to keep a low profile and recover. However, they killed a half-step supreme being of the wildland. This is simply reaping what they sowed. Now that they've been discovered, it's possible that both sides will perish. Hopefully, this sect still has some conscience and won't massacre the entire city. Tang Yin opened his eyes and sighed. Tang Yin stopped cultivating. Zhu Yu, who had been standing outside the tent, walked in with a respectful expression. After all, Tang Yin was a 7th grade battle saint. Many thanks for senior's help, Zhu Yu said. Tang Yin waved his hand. He had only received an order from the Great Elder. Currently, many experts from the various factions had been sent out, and he was the only one sent to assist Mo Luo City. Anai Yen went to help the Western Mystery City. However, as an ancient city of the Light Wind Empire, the Western Mystery City was once the ancient capital of many empires. The Shura sect demons naturally did not dare to offend it too much. After all, the ancient city still had its own dignity. Commander Zhu, what's the situation in Mo Luo City? Tang Yin asked the question he was most concerned about. Once Mo Luo City was captured, the Western Mystery City would be isolated. When that time came, it would truly be in danger. I also did not receive a secret letter from the spies in Mo Luo City. However, Mo Luo City is near the territory of the 13 bandits of Majo. Even though they are bandits, if Mo Luo City is captured by King Yu's men, their territory will shrink by quite a bit. They won't have a good time either. Therefore, if they lend a hand, Mo Luo City might be able to hold out for a while. Zhu Yu analyzed. This was only his speculation. He did not know if the 13 bandits of Majo would lend a hand. The 13 bandits of Majo? Tang Yin had a slightly strange expression on his face. The first time he met the 13 bandits of Majo was in Ownerbu's store. At that time, the cultivation level of the 13 bandits of Majo was merely a 6th grade battle emperor. However, he heard that after they returned from Ownerbu's store, many of them had a breakthrough in their cultivation level. Currently, the 13 bandits of Majo was a major force in the Light Wind Empire. Senior, I have already sent people back to Western Mystery City to request for reinforcements. When the elites of the Western Mystery Army's First Corps arrive, these enemies will be nothing. Tang Yin nodded his head. However, he was a little disinterested. Suddenly, a fragrant aroma drifted in from outside the tent. Tang Yin's expression slightly changed. His nose slightly wrinkled and his expression was a little surprised. How fragrant! Zhu Yu was also incomparably astonished. The appearance of this aroma was indeed a little sudden. Tang Yin walked out of the tent and stood at the entrance. He squinted his eyes and tilted his head as he sniffed the aroma. Commander Zhu, I didn't expect the culinary skills of the cooks of the Third Corps to be so good. Such a rich aroma, I have only smelled it in the Imperial City before. Tang Yin smiled as he said to Zhu Yu. The aroma of the dishes cooked by Ownerbu was the most fragrant he had ever smelled. He did not expect that he would be able to smell it in the army. For a moment, he became a little hungry. Zhu Yu immediately let out a loud laugh and invited Tang Yin to taste the delicacies. Long Kai's face was filled with intoxication as he stood at the side, dumbstruck. The aroma that permeated the air was so rich that it seemed as though it was going to materialize and envelop him. He had never smelled such a fragrant aroma before. It simply made all the pores on his body open up. In the distance, Bu Fang was holding a large iron ladle. There were 4 cauldrons surrounding him. Each of the cauldrons was burning with raging flames. The flames were surging and emitting scorching heat. Bu Fang was stirring the cauldrons with a large iron ladle. His true energy enveloped the iron ladle as if it was attached to his mental energy. Every time he stirred the cauldrons, he would control the taste of the ingredients in the cauldrons to the best. Because these ingredients were all ordinary ingredients, Bu Fang could only rely on adjusting the taste of the ingredients to enhance the taste. There were 4 cauldrons, and each of the cauldrons contained a different dish. However, they were all varied and contained almost all kinds of ingredient. Even though there were so many ingredients mixed together, the taste did not affect each other. Instead, it caused the aroma to be extremely rich. This was related to Bu Fang's cooking method. True energy cooking was able to adjust the true energy within the ingredient. For ingredients without true energy, the only thing that could be adjusted was the taste and taste. Under the control of true energy cooking, the taste of each ingredient would be independent and burst forth with a unique fragrance. When these fragrances were mixed in the air, they emitted an intoxicating fragrance. It was not an exaggeration to say that the aroma could spread for 10 miles. The aroma emitted from the 4 boiling cauldrons spread along with the morning breeze and blew across the entire camp. Tang Yin wasn't the only one who smelled it. Almost all the soldiers in the camp smelled it, and everyone was extremely surprised. Wei Dafu was a little sluggish. His hand that was holding the ladle stiffened as he smelled the aroma in disbelief. This aroma? Captain Wei, what are you guys cooking? This aroma is really fragrant. While Wei Dafu was in a daze, Zhu Yu had already brought Tang Yin over with a face full of smiles. Zhu Yu was very satisfied in his heart. It seemed like this Wei Dafu had brought out his trump card. He knew how to use dishes to boost the morale of the soldiers when their morale was low. Not bad, he had a bright future ahead of him. Why was Commander Zhu here? Wei Dafu was startled. When he saw Zhu Yu walking over, he had an awkward expression on his face. He quickly stopped what he was doing and walked over. The aroma isn't coming from here. Tang Yin indifferently glanced at Wei Dafu and directly ignored him. Instead, he sniffed the aroma in the air and continued walking forward. An awkward expression flashed across Zhu Yu's face and he also followed. It wasn't Wei Dafu? Then who else in the cook's army unit could have such good culinary skills? A trace of anger flashed across Wei Dafu's face. It was definitely that brat again. Tang Yin clasped his hands behind his back and walked at the front. Zhu Yu and Wei Dafu followed behind him. After passing by the tents, their eyes quickly lit up as they found the source of the aroma. The first thing that entered their eyes were 4 large woks. The woks that were continuously boiling under the flames attracted their eyes. Moreover, the aroma emitted from the woks was also somewhat intoxicating. Cooking with 4 woks at the same time? Captain Wei, when did you get such an amazing cook? Zhu Yu exclaimed in surprise. Cooking with 4 woks, and the aroma from each wok was still so strong. This skill was indisputable. Senior, let's go over and have a taste. This aroma is really tempting. Zhu Yu raised his head and said as he looked at Tang Yin. However, Zhu Yu's eyes narrowed. He discovered that Tang Yin's expression was a little strange. This was because Tang Yin's gaze was not on the 4 shocking cauldrons, nor was he attracted by the fragrance wafting out of the cauldrons. Instead, his gaze was fixed on the thin young man who was calmly walking around the 4 cauldrons with an iron spoon in his hand. Chapter 294. On top of the towering city walls of Mo Luo City, several figures were proudly standing there. Hui Feng was wearing a scholarly white robe, but his hair was in a mess. Beside him were the brothers of the 13 bandits of Mazhou. However, their numbers had decreased significantly. We, the 13 bandits of Mazhou, have never suffered such a huge loss before. If we were to flee with our tails between our legs, I would be letting down our deceased brothers. Hui Feng's eyes were bloodshot and the vicious aura he exuded was somewhat incompatible with his attire. Of the 13 bandits of Mazhou, only 7 brothers were left. 5 of them had fallen on the battlefield and were killed by King Yu's troop. That black-robed expert from King Yu's troops. Even if I die, I will drag him to hell with me. Beside him, the remaining bandits all had mournful looks on their faces. The 7th master had lost an arm. As he looked at the oppressive army that was charging toward Mo Luo City, a hint of madness flashed through his eyes. Bu Fang did not notice Tang Yin's arrival. Instead, he continued to concentrate on cooking. His figure was very calm as he skillfully held onto the large ladle and stirred the 4 pots, causing the fragrance to surge out from the pots. Owner Bu? Senior Bu? Tang Yin's gaze was slightly dull and doubtful. He wondered if he was hallucinating. How could Owner Bu appear in the Northwest Territory? However, looking at the person who was as calm as ever and his proficient cooking skills, Tang Yin was certain that this person was Owner Bu. That was because Owner Bu's temperament was simply too obvious. Zhu Yu felt that Tang Yin's gaze was a little strange. He followed Tang Yin's gaze and saw the young man who was cooking. Wasn't he just a young man? Sir. His name is Bu Fang. He's the new cook. Wei Dafu slightly bowed and hurriedly said, "This newcomer is a little arrogant and unruly, so he still needs to temper his temper a little. Let him stay in the cooking position for now." A newcomer? It is normal for a newcomer to be a little arrogant. However, this kid really has the ability to be arrogant. His skill is indescribable. Zhu Yu nodded his head. As he sniffed the fragrance that permeated the air, a look of admiration appeared on his face. However, when Tang Yin heard Wei Dafu's words, his expression became increasingly strange. He turned his head to look at Wei Dafu and indifferently said, "Arrogant and unruly? Whetting your temper." That's right." Wei Dafu stuttered as he was stared at by Tang Yin. Tang Yin turned his head and coldly smiled. Then, he tidied up his clothes and solemnly walked toward Bufang. Zhu Yu and Wei Dafu looked at each other. A bad premonition surged in Wei Dafu's heart. Could it be that senior knows that brat? Could it be that the kid is a junior that senior knows? Wei Dafu's heart thumped, and a bitter expression appeared on his face. The 4 woks were all boiling. The ingredients inside were boiling and emitting steam. Suddenly, Bufang pulled out the iron ladle in his hand. With a twist of his hand, the lids of the 4 woks were covered, concealing the fragrance. After doing all this, Bufang raised his head and looked at the 3 people walking toward him. He knew both Wei Dafu and Zhu Yu. However, the one walking in front was even more familiar. "Senior. What a coincidence." Tang Yin walked in front of Bufang and respectfully cupped his hands. Tang Yin had always been respectful toward Bufang. This youth was too mysterious and always gave people an unfathomable feeling. "Say, Senior?" When Wei Dafu heard how Tang Yin addressed Bufang, his legs immediately went soft and he almost fell on his butt. "What the hell? You, a 7th grade battle saint, addressed this youth as senior? Can't you speak properly?" Zhu Yu also slightly opened his mouth. He was somewhat astonished. Could it be that Tang Yin recognized the wrong person? The youth in front of him didn't seem to have a high cultivation level? That's right, it is indeed a coincidence. Why are you here? Isn't this the army? Bufang looked at Tang Yin and calmly asked. The corner of Tang Yin's mouth twitched. Shouldn't I be the one asking you this? You're a chef. Why aren't you cooking in your own shop? What are you doing in the army? Because of some unavoidable reasons, I came to help out in the army. Why is Owner Bu in the army? Moreover, in the army of Western Mystery City, which is quite far from the Imperial City. I came to experience what it feels like to be a chef in the army and enhance my culinary skills. This way, when I cook, I can focus more on different emotions. Bufang casually spouted nonsense. What he said was just a dignified reason on the surface. In fact, he just wanted to complete the task and obtain the reward. However, Tang Yin didn't understand. After listening to Bufang's words, he suddenly felt a surge of admiration from the bottom of his heart. It was no wonder that Owner Bu's culinary skills could reach such a level. It turned out that he had been undergoing arduous culinary training in order to improve his culinary skills. Being a chef in the army was a tough job. In order to improve his culinary skills, Owner Bu actually spared no effort to join the Cook's Army unit of the Western Mystery Army. This kind of spirit was simply a role model for his generation. As expected, if one wanted to achieve something in any profession, he would need to put in a lot of effort. The 2 of them were chatting happily. However, Zhu Yu and Wei Dafu's complexion became somewhat strange. Zhu Yu was still fine and was only a little suspicious. However, Wei Dafu's complexion had already turned pale. A chef. Why would he be so familiar with a 7th grade battle saint? Since he knew such an existence, why did he join the Western Mystery Army? To make fun of us? What dish is Owner Bu cooking? It smells so good. After chatting for a while, Tang Yin's gaze fell on the 4 big woks. A trace of excitement surged in his eyes. They aren't anything special. They're all made with ordinary ingredients, Bufang calmly said. These are prepared for the soldiers. After Bu Fang finished speaking, he opened the lid of the wok. Immediately, a surging fragrance gushed out. Ordinary ingredients? Tang Yin was taken aback. He walked toward the woks and looked inside. The ingredients in the woks were brightly colored. The dishes in each wok were different. However, one thing was clear: these were all ordinary ingredients. Even though the cook's army unit used ordinary ingredients to cook, it was rare. This was because ordinary ingredients were unable to maintain the soldiers' condition. Therefore, the majority of the cooks would cook dishes with spirit energy ingredient. Zhu Yu, who was standing behind Tang Yin, squinted his eyes and glanced at Wei Dafu, who had an ugly expression on his face. He knew what was going on. This is called the Four Treasures Soup. It's a dish that I cooked using all the ingredients. Since it was cooked in 4 woks at the same time, the essence of the ingredients was extracted. That's why it's called the Four Treasures Soup, Bu Fang introduced. He took out a ceramic bowl and scooped out a spoonful of soup from each of the 4 wok. He poured the soup into the bowl. The 4 kinds of soup were mixed in the bowl, but they were clearly separated. Each of them occupied a separate area and did not mix with the other. Try it. Bu Fang handed the ceramic bowl to Tang Yin. The steaming hot air was accompanied by a tempting fragrance. Tang Yin subconsciously took the ceramic bowl. He scooped up a mouthful of soup. Tang Yin's eyes immediately widened. This mouthful of soup seemed to be dispersing in his mouth, and all sorts of flavors flooded his mind. This mouthful of soup seemed to have fused with countless ingredients. The flavors constantly changed in his mouth, and it was incomparably refreshing. This is unbelievable. Was this really cooked using ordinary ingredients? Tang Yin was in a state of shock for a long time. The higher his cultivation level, the more he understood the difference between ingredients with spirit energy. The more precious the spirit energy contained in the ingredients, the more concentrated the spirit energy. When cooked, the fragrance and taste would be more delicious. Bu Fang actually used ordinary ingredients to cook the taste of ingredients with spirit energy. As expected of the black-hearted owner of the Imperial City's little black-hearted store, the solemn voice of the system echoed in Bu Fang's mind. This Four Treasures Soup was actually recognized by the system. It became the first dish that was recognized by the system in the cook's army unit. So, he only needed to cook 2 dishes that were judged to be qualified by the system to complete the mission and obtain the fragment of the God of Cooking set? Bu Fang suddenly felt a little happy in his heart. Zhu Yu and Wei Dafu also scooped up a bowl of soup each. After drinking it, they were speechless for a long time. Zhu Yu was shocked, while Wei Dafu was silent. Wei Dafu knew that he was wrong, extremely wrong. This Bu Fang's culinary skills had already far exceeded the scope of his imagination. It was already an existence that he could only look up to. Just this Four Treasures Soup alone was not something that he could cook. Although this Four Treasures Soup was only made with ordinary ingredients, after drinking it, he felt his condition improving rapidly. He actually felt like he was drinking a dish made with spirit energy ingredient. Wei Dafu was incomparably bitter. Good. Wei Dafu with the young master's culinary skills, you actually want to bury him. I think you must be old and blind. Since you like to bury people so much, then in the future, you and the young master should exchange positions. From now on, the young master will be the captain of the cook's army unit. Zhu Yu's complexion turned cold as he sneered. Wei Dafu's body suddenly trembled, and his face was filled with bitterness. Tang Yin squinted his eyes as he drank the soup. This warm soup flowed into his heart and seemed to make his injuries slightly better. He minded his own business and drank the soup. As for Zhu Yu punishing Wei Dafu, he was too lazy to even look at it. There's no need. I'm not interested in this captain position. Just prepare the spirit energy ingredients for me. Bu Fang interrupted Zhu Yu's words. He was not the least bit interested in the captain of the cook's army unit. He only wanted to cook good dishes and make them pass the system's evaluation as soon as possible. However, Zhu Yu still made a decision in the end. Wei Dafu was still left in the area for cooking ordinary ingredient. Several cooks of the cook's army unit carried Bufang's 4 cauldrons and left the area. They arrived at the soldiers' tents and distributed the 4 treasures soup. Mo Lin pulled the reins and sat on the back of the spirit beast. Behind him was a densely packed army. He gazed at the Western Mystery Army, which had set up camp in the distance, and a trace of a sneer appeared on his face. A figure was floating in the air. He was holding a talisman in his hand. The talismans converged into a magic array and revolved around his hand. The Western Mystery Army is just a distance away. Let's go and annihilate them. The 7th grade battle saint supporting them is injured and is not in a good condition. This is the best time to attack. After annihilating the Western Mystery Army, we can turn to Mo Luo City and completely occupy it. After that, we can launch an attack on the Western Mystery City. The black-robed elder was floating in the air. His sleeves fluttered as he spoke in an awe-inspiring manner. Mo Lin's eyes immediately lit up. He waved the long spear in his hand and bellowed. Then, the army behind him charged toward the Western Mystery Army's camp. Chapter 295. It smells so good, it's really delicious. Yes, this dish is really good. It's so delicious, I feel like my whole body is full of energy after drinking it. Bufang's 4 treasures soup was distributed to the soldiers. Every soldier who drank it was full of praise. This dish was truly delicious. Although the dishes cooked by Bufang were made with ordinary ingredients that did not contain any spirit energy, because Bufang's cooking method was based on true energy, a trace of his true energy would always seep into the dish and nourish it. This was the main reason why the dish was so delicious. Owner Bu is indeed Owner Bu. Your dishes are still so popular, Tang Yin said with a smile. It was really unbelievable that Bufang would appear in this army camp. He was hesitating whether he should tell his master Ni Yen. However, after thinking about it, he decided to wait until he returned to the Western Mystery City. It was a rare opportunity to drink Owner Bu's soup for free. Therefore, Tang Yin joined the soldiers and got himself a few portions of the soup. However, just as everyone was drinking the soup, a war cry came from outside the camp. The sound of a bugle horn lingered in the camp. Zhu Yu's complexion suddenly changed. He drank the hot soup in his bowl in one gulp, then turned around and walked out of the camp. The sound of the bugle horn indicated that the enemy had come to attack the camp. The Western Mystery Army had already been forced out of Mo Luo City's territory, but the enemy was still so overbearing. Zhu Yu's complexion was somewhat ugly and filled with anger. After reminding Owner Bu to be careful, Tang Yin also turned around and left. Since the enemy had come to attack, the Shura sect's sorcerer would probably appear as well. He wanted to kill all of them and turn them into the souls of the magic array in his hands. Although Bufang's soup wasn't much, there were still several hundred soldiers who drank it. These several hundred soldiers felt their spirits trembling, and they brandished their weapons as they charged out of the camp. Their monstrous aura stunned the enemies who were charging at them. The battle soon erupted again. The 2 armies clashed with a loud bang, and the sound of war cries was deafening. Inside the campsite, Bufang collected the 4 woks that had been distributed. Then, he carried the woks and planned to walk toward his tent. Wei Dafu and many soldiers of the cook's army unit stood in the distance with complicated expressions on their faces. They looked at Bufang with unsightly expressions. They didn't know how to face Bufang. They thought he was just a newcomer that they could bully at will, but they didn't expect him to have such a strong background. Wei Dafu didn't want to believe it, but the scene he just saw was enough to prove it. As for Wei Dafu, His fate was to be reduced from the captain of the Cook's Army unit to an ordinary cook in the Cook's Army unit. This was worse than killing him. Buzz buzz. The sound of 2 bowstrings being pulled rang out. Then, arrows as fast as lightning burst forth from afar, instantly piercing through the 2 Cook's Army guards. Wei Dafu and the others widened their eyes as they raised their heads to look into the distance. There were dozens of figures riding spirit beasts galloping over. "It's the enemy!" Wei Dafu and the others immediately shouted. The location of the supply transport had actually been discovered by the enemy, and they were charging over. This was enough to prove the cruelty of this war. Once the supply was destroyed, it meant that the soldiers of the Western Mystery Army would lose their food supply. This was definitely a disaster for the soldiers of the Third Corporation. At this time, the Cook's Army unit needed to join the battle. Protecting the supply was their responsibility. They could hold kitchen knives or machetes. The number of enemies wasn't large, but each of them was skilled. Moreover, these enemies were riding spirit beasts, so their speed was too fast. Swoosh swoosh. Arrows were shot from the longbows in the hands of the enemies. Their speed was extremely fast. In just a short while, several Cook's Army guards were shot and nailed to the ground. Bu Fang's pupils constricted. For the first time, he felt a cold, killing intent sweeping over. This was war, a real battlefield where only one side could survive. Destroy the supply. The general has given the order. We must not let a single soldier of the Western Mystery Army return. A deafening roar came from among the enemies. Their imposing manner made the Cook's Army guards' legs weak. They felt a little hopeless. Their numbers were about the same as the enemies, but in terms of battle prowess, they were much weaker. Bu Fang, who was carrying 4 woks on his back, slightly moved his body and dodged the round of arrows. His gaze was solemn as he looked at the group of soldiers charging over. Xiao Bai appeared beside him. His mechanical eyes flickered with a red glow that sent chills down one's spine. Ding, ding, ding. One arrow after another hit its body, emitting a crisp sound. Then, with a sweep of Xiao Bai's hand, all the arrows were swept away and broken. The enemies riding on the spirit beasts were also taken aback. They didn't expect that the iron lump that suddenly appeared would be able to block all their arrows. However, they didn't pay too much attention to it. The sound of hooves resounded as 2 enemies charged toward Xiao Bai and Bu Fang with spears in their hands. Since arrows couldn't penetrate it, they would just use spears. After all, anyone who obstructed them from destroying the supply would have to die. Their goal was to destroy the Western Mystery Army's supply so that everyone in the Western Mystery Army would be left behind. This group of people was Mo Lin's capable subordinate. Every one of them had a high level of cultivation. Mo Lin sent them out to destroy the supply for safety reasons. Killing intent detected. Purple eye mode activated. Xiao Bai muttered. Then, his red eyes turned into a deep purple. The purple was so deep that it seemed capable of stealing one's soul. 2 swiftly galloping spirit beasts, 2 4th-grade battle spirits, and 2 spears charged toward Xiao Bai and Bu Fang mercilessly. The moment the purple eye mode was activated, Xiao Bai's entire aura changed. His figure instantly shot out and blocked in front of Bu Fang. He raised his palm and actually tried to grab the 2 spears. "You're courting death." The enemies widened their eyes and fiercely thrust out their spears. However, Xiao Bai's palm forcefully grabbed onto the 2 spears. Sparks flew in all directions, causing the 2 people who were charging forward to be pushed off the back of the spirit beasts due to inertia. A purple light flashed in Xiao Bai's eyes. He shook his palm that was holding onto the tips of the 2 spears and forcefully swung them down. The 2 spirit beasts were ruthlessly slammed onto the ground and stopped their forward momentum. The spirit beasts were only 2nd-grade spirit beasts. How could they withstand such an attack? They immediately fell to the ground and spat out blood as they panted heavily. The 2 enemy soldiers were also swept away by the spears. Then, Xiao Bai casually tossed them out. The spears directly pierced through them and nailed them to the ground. Fresh blood flowed all over the ground. This scene was shocking. Regardless of whether it was the enemies or the soldiers from the Cook's army unit, they were all dumbfounded as they looked at this scene. Wei Dafu fell to the ground on his butt, and his mouth was trembling. That scene was too terrifying. The two enemy soldiers who were nailed to the ground were still staring with their eyes wide open. They were filled with unwillingness. This clothes-stripping demon was actually so violent. Those were cavalrymen who were charging at a high speed, yet they were forcefully pulled down. Their spirit beasts were whipped to death, and they were nailed to the ground. It turned out that there was such a terrifying existence around Bufang. They actually foolishly went to find trouble with him. When they recalled that Xiao Bai only stripped them of their clothes, they felt a wave of relief. With the strength of that metal lump, killing them would be as easy as flipping his palm. Bufang carried 4 walks on his back. He indifferently swept his gaze over the two enemies who were nailed to the ground. Then, he swept his gaze over Wei Dafu and the others who were holding onto their long blades and preparing to fight against the enemies. His face was expressionless as he turned around and continued forward. The small group of enemies was enraged. One after another, they roared and charged toward Xiao Bai. Their small group was one of Mo Lin's powerful subordinates. However, they had lost many people in this mission. Xiao Bai's purple eyes flickered. His arm quickly transformed into a huge machete. Dozens of people surrounded Xiao Bai. Xiao Bai fiercely charged forward. Then, the Cook's army unit witnessed a scene that they would never forget for the rest of their lives. The enemies who were pressuring them to the point where they couldn't even breathe were actually destroyed by that metal lump. Fresh blood splattered everywhere. With every slash, this group of people was slaughtered by that metal lump. They didn't even have the strength to retaliate. Among the corpses on the ground, Xiao Bai's spotlessly white body slowly stood up. The blood that splattered on his body was automatically expelled, leaving him untainted by even a speck of dust. Xiao Bai's purple eyes flickered and then turned into a red glow. His mechanical head turned and swept a glance at the Cook's army unit, who were all looking at him in fear. Then, he strode forward and chased after Bufang, who was carrying 4 walks on his back. The wind blew, blowing away the blood on the ground. Wei Dafu felt that it was a miracle that he was still alive. Chapter 296. Battle cries reverberated throughout the entire campsite. Sparks flew everywhere, and the sound of arrows being shot was enough to tear one's mind apart, causing goosebumps to rise all over one's body. Mo Lin led his cavalry and charged into the midst of the enemy. They were invincible, and wherever their long spears swept across, they left a trail of blood behind them. Zhu Yu charged over and clashed with Mo Lin. The commanders of the two armies finally engaged in a fierce battle. Both of them fought until their blood boiled, and their eyes were bloodshot. In the sky, a black-robed Shura sect warrior hovered in the air, holding 5 spinning talismans in his hand. The talismans emitted a demonic glow, as if emitting a peculiar suction force, absorbing the remnant souls and spiritual essences of the numerous corpses below. Before the corpses of the soldiers on the ground had even turned cold, their wailing spiritual essences were dragged out and absorbed into the array formed by the talismans. The black-robed man's eyes were filled with excitement, and the muscles on his face twitched uncontrollably. A ray of sword light flashed as Tang Yin dashed out from the campsite, aiming straight for the Shura sect warrior holding the talisman array. The expert immediately let out an explosive roar. Pitch-black true energy surged forth and slapped toward Tang Yin's sword light. This palm strike was filled with an imposing aura that was enough to shake a mountain as it came crashing down with a loud bang. Tang Yin's expression immediately became extremely solemn. His body was already heavily injured, and facing this palm strike, he felt an immense pressure. The battle in the sky did not slow down the battle below. The two armies fought back and forth, and blood splattered on the yellow sand. Wei Dafu heaved a sigh of relief, but his entire body felt cold. Not only him, but everyone in the cook's army unit was trembling on the ground, not daring to even breathe loudly. The corpses that littered the ground were like nightmares, reflected in the depths of their eyes. Even though these were the corpses of their enemies, the scene just now was truly unforgettable. That lump of metal was actually so powerful that they found it hard to breathe. However, even though they were shocked and frightened, they heaved a sigh of relief in their hearts. Their rations were safe, and they now had hope again. Wei Dafu and the rest stood up and began to process the rations, preparing to transport them away. However, just as they pushed away some provisions, the ground began to tremble. The sound of horse hooves colliding with the ground entered their ears. In their vision, another group of people charged over. Enemies! Everyone in the cook's army unit shouted and pulled out their machetes. Some of them couldn't find their machetes, so they held onto their kitchen knives instead. It was quite an imposing sight. There were only 3 enemies. All 3 of them wore black robes, and their auras were somewhat sinister. They looked at the corpses on the ground and frowned. There's actually an expert guarding the rear of the rations. I was wondering why this elite team couldn't complete the mission after so long. So it's because they met an expert. The black-robed expert laughed coldly. He glanced at the corpses on the ground and then at the cook's army unit. His face suddenly turned cold. However, all of you have to die. The black-robed expert's eyes widened. He suddenly tapped the ground with the tip of his foot and galloped down from his horse. His claw, which was accompanied by a surge of pitch-black true energy, pierced through the chests of several Cook's army unit members and killed them. These 3 were experts of the Shura sect. Their cultivation level had reached 5th grade Battle King. They were like wolves that had entered a flock of sheep. Killing them was as easy as flipping their hand. Long Kai turned around in fright. Facing these 3 demon-like people, he simply couldn't muster up the courage to resist. He turned around and fled into the distance. Wei Dafu was the same. He frantically ran away. He also wanted to protect the rations, but the cultivation level of these 3 people was too high. Even though he wanted to, he didn't have the strength. Trying to escape? One of the black-robed experts sneered and immediately dashed forward. His target was Long Kai. His blood-stained claw was aimed at Long Kai's heart. Long Kai's tender face was filled with terror. His entire body was frozen stiff by the killing intent that was sweeping toward him. Just as the bloody claw, which was dripping with blood, was about to pierce through Long Kai's body, an indifferent voice came from not far away. It was accompanied by a whistling sound. "You can't kill him." The indifferent voice was devoid of any emotion. A black walk spun and whistled toward the black-robed expert. "What the hell?" The black-robed expert squinted his eyes. He was actually startled by a walk that was flying toward him. The black-robed expert was infuriated. He casually swatted the walk in an attempt to shatter it. However, when the bloody claw collided with the walk, it was sent flying by a terrifying force. The black walk exploded in midair. Bufang slowly walked over from afar. Xiao Bai followed beside him. Xiao Bai's eyes turned a deep purple with every step he took. "Looks like you are the hidden expert. You actually killed an elite squad of ours. You have some guts." The black-robed expert sneered. Then, the 3 of them gathered together and looked at Bufang. Bufang patted Xiao Bai's plump belly. The corners of his mouth curled up. He was too lazy to talk nonsense with this group of people. Boom, boom, boom. 3 surging waves of true energy spread out. The aura of these 3 people had actually reached the Battle King level. In the army, a Battle King was in existence that could become a commander. It was no wonder that the Cook's army unit was not a match for these 3 people. The purple radiance suddenly flourished, causing the figures of the 3 people to freeze. Then, they felt a gust of cold wind and a figure rapidly dashed toward them. It was the iron puppet beside the youth. He actually dared to rely on a puppet to deal with them? Was he looking down on them? Bufang stood with his hands clasped behind his back. His face was indifferent as he calmly watched the battle. With Xiao Bai's appearance, he was very calm. The cruelty of war was beyond his imagination. In this battlefield, life seemed to have become somewhat insignificant. The cooks who were just talking about delicacies with him a moment ago had now turned into ice-cold corpses. It really made people sigh. Kill them all. Bufang sighed. His gaze was slightly gloomy as he said. Xiao Bai's figure paused for a moment. Then, like a storm, he dashed out. His fist smashed out as if it could break a mountain. A black-robed expert was sent flying. His chest was deeply caved in, and he was completely unable to retaliate. Poochie! A mouthful of blood spurted out from the black-robed expert's mouth. That person directly fell to the ground. He did not even have the strength to crawl back up. With one of his hands turned into a huge machete, Xiao Bai fiercely stomped his foot. Then, he dashed out as fast as lightning. The blade flashed. How could the two people, who were already shocked, block it? In just an instant they were sent flying. Their abdomens were cut horizontally, and their blood gushed out like a fountain. 3 Battle King experts, in the hands of Xiao Bai, did not even have the slightest ability to retaliate. Boom! 1 punch for each person. After 3 punches, Xiao Bai reverted back to his original red-eyed appearance, and returned to Bufang's side. A good military chef's training was actually ruined just like that. It's really annoying. Bufang scratched his head, took a deep breath, and muttered. Then, his gaze became sharp. He brought Xiao Bai into the distance and slowly walked away. In that direction, battle cries shook the heavens. Long Kai and Wei Dafu's eyes were wide open. They hid in a corner and shivered, not even daring to breathe loudly. Those 3 powerful cultivators in the hands of that lump of metal couldn't even withstand one move. The outcome of the battle was decided in an instant. Just how terrifying was that lump of metal? Long Kai tremblingly crawled up from the ground. He actually mustered up his courage and scrambled to follow behind Bufang, running toward the direction where Bufang disappeared. Tang Yin spurted out a mouthful of blood. His complexion became a little sallow. The Shura sect warrior standing proudly in the sky in the distance forced him to vomit blood with just one hand. The two of them were not on the same level at all. After all, he had just become a 7th-grade battle saint. Compared to a veteran 7th-grade battle saint, the gap was still too big. Especially the opponent's pitch-black true energy. When it bombarded him, it carried a corrosive power. He had to constantly summon his true energy to defend, or else he would be seriously injured by the corrosion. As time went by, he was no longer a match for the opponent. The Celestial Arcanum sect actually sent a piece of trash like you. Does the Celestial Arcanum sect really think that there's no one left in the Shura sect? The warrior sneered as he swatted the longsword in Tang Yin's hand. Then, with a turn of his hand, a blood-colored longsword suddenly appeared in his hand. With a wave of the sword, a blood-colored sword energy tore through the air and slashed toward Tang Yin, intending to kill him. The Shura sect warrior was very excited. Tang Yin was a 7th-grade battle saint. Even though he had just advanced, he was still a 7th-grade battle saint. His soul essence must be very rich. Tang Yin's soul essence was equivalent to the soul essences of dozens of soldiers. If he could collect this soul essence, then his trip would truly be a success. He could even complete the task assigned by the High Priestess. With a slash of the sword, blood splattered everywhere. Tang Yin's pupils shrank as he was forcefully slashed into the ground, causing a violent explosion to erupt from the impact. Cough cough, spitting out a mouthful of blood, Tang Yin crawled up from the ground with a pale complexion. He felt that he was going to die here. He was no match for the Shura sect demon. Looks like you're the mastermind. Are you the one who ruined my military training? An indifferent voice rang out. Then, from the distance, two figures leisurely strolled over from the battle of tens of thousands of soldiers. Tang Yin was taken aback. He turned his head to look and his pupils shrank. Senior Bu. Tang Yin's face suddenly revealed an excited expression. That's right, he had actually forgotten about the terrifying existence known as Bufang. He had long since heard about the battle in the imperial city. That battle was terrifying, and it had also made Bufang's little store famous. Many experts had turned into skeletons in that battle. Holding the 5 rotating jade talismans in one hand, the Shura sect warrior tilted his head and squinted his eyes at the slowly approaching Bufang and Xiao Bai. Who are you? Another one coming to die? A mere 6th grade battle emperor. How dare you be so arrogant? As a veteran 7th grade battle saint, this Shura sect warrior naturally had discerning eyes. Even though Bufang's cultivation level wasn't obvious, he could still tell at a glance that Bufang was a 6th grade battle emperor. As for the iron puppet, it didn't emit any true energy waves, so he didn't pay much attention to it. A 7th grade battle saint and a 6th grade battle emperor. The corners of the Shura sect warrior's mouth curled up. Another one coming to deliver soul essences. Looks like the harvest this time will be great. Chapter 297. In the Western Mystery City, the city lord, Kong Yao, was respectfully following behind a tall and slender woman. Beside him was his eldest son, Kong Xian. Not only was there respect on his face, but there was also an unconcealable look of adoration. Kong Xian's heart was burning with passion. His body couldn't help but tremble as he looked at the woman in front of him. It was the first time he had seen such a beautiful woman, a woman he had fallen in love with at first sight. The third elder of the Celestial Arcanum sect, Yen, was said to be an 8th grade war god. She had a strong cultivation level and a beautiful face. Her whole body emitted an irresistible charm. Kong Xian was deeply captivated by her. Yen clasped her hands behind her back as she strolled on top of the Western Mystery City. Her fine black hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall. She raised her head, her fair skin tinged with a tinge of redness. Her big eyes stared straight at the dark sky in the distance. You only sent the 3rd Corp to support Mo Luo City? Yen asked calmly, her voice a little cold. Elder don't underestimate the 3rd Corp of the Western Mystery City. Although it is the weakest troop in the Western Mystery Army, it is comparable to the elite troops of a big city. It is more than enough to support Mo Luo City, Kong Xian said confidently. Kong Yao smiled and stroked his beard. He trusted in his son's confidence. As the city lord of Western Mystery City, he had presided over the Northwest for so many years. There were very few things that could endanger Western Mystery City, so he was very carefree. Yen frowned and coldly glanced at the extraordinarily handsome and confident Kong Xian. She said, "What if the 3rd Corp of the Western Mystery City fails and is annihilated?" "Impossible," Kong Xian said. "Haha. If Mo Luo City is taken, it is equivalent to grabbing the lifeline of the Western Mystery City. The Western Mystery City will fall into the enemy's encirclement. I don't know what trump card the Western Mystery City has, but I am here to help to prevent the Shura sect demons from wantonly killing. As for the survival of the Western Mystery City, it has nothing to do with me." Yen smiled coldly. She was in a bad mood. She glanced at the father and son, then turned around and left. Kong Yao and Kong Xian froze on the spot and looked at each other. "Father, why don't we send the 1st Army there?" "Elder has a point," Kong Xian said after thinking for a while. "I'll leave this matter to you." Kong Yao stroked his beard and chuckled. "I really don't know what right you, a mere 6th grade battle emperor, have to be so arrogant." The Shura sect expert hovered in the air, holding 5 jade talismans in his hands. The array was still spinning, and wailing white spiritual essences were constantly injected into it. This array was so evil. Bufang's gaze swept through the array and he furrowed his brows. Senior Bu, this person is a demon from the Shura sect. His cultivation level is very high. They are currently leading the war against the Light Wind Empire and plundering countless spiritual essences and souls. They are definitely plotting something big. We must stop him, Tang Yin said as he clutched his chest and blood dripped from the corner of his mouth. Shura sect. Bufang narrowed his eyes. Another force he had never heard of, but what did it have to do with him? Noisy. The Shura sect will eventually rise again. You people who dare to stop the rise of the Shura sect must die. The expert bellowed. The aura on his body became stronger and stronger, and there seemed to be light surging in his eyes. With a whistling sound, the Shura sect expert appeared in front of Bufang. His claw, which was emitting a blood-red radiance and surrounded by pitch-black true energy, slammed down on Bufang. A 6th-grade battle emperor was truly nothing in his eyes. However, obtaining the spiritual essence of a 6th-grade battle emperor was not a bad deal. He was not the slightest bit worried that Bufang could withstand this attack. The power of this claw was not something a mere 6th-grade battle emperor could withstand. Moreover, the Celestial Arcanum sect's 7th-grade battle saint was already seriously injured and did not have the ability to withstand this attack. Therefore, in his eyes, Bufang must die. Bang! A giant steel palm suddenly appeared in front of him. The blood-red claw ruthlessly smashed onto the steel palm, producing a violent sound. The Shura sect expert's face froze, and his figure swiftly retreated. Violent waves of air surged out in all directions, swirling up thousands of sandstorms. Bufang stood indifferently with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the retreating Shura sect expert. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes had already turned into a deep purple, once again activating the purple eye mode. Tang Yin looked at Xiao Bai's figure and was suddenly excited. He knew that Xiao Bai was very strong. It seemed that even 8th-grade war gods could not defeat Xiao Bai. Since Xiao Bai was here, this time victory was in the bag. Boom! Without saying a word, Whitey dashed out at an extremely fast speed. With a single leap, it leaped high into the air, bringing with it a surging wave of pressure as it charged towards the Shura sect warrior. What? The Shura sect expert was extremely shocked at this moment. He did not expect this iron lump to be able to withstand his attack. Indeed, you have the capital to be arrogant. With a sneer, the blood-red light in the Shura sect expert's eyes suddenly intensified. Then, he clenched one of his hands, and the surging pitch-black true energy converged together, forming a giant energy ball. That energy ball ruthlessly smashed toward Whitey, who was rushing over. With a loud bang, the sky lit up. The explosion occurred in the air, and countless waves of air rolled out. In the sky, a giant energy ball enveloped Xiao Bai's body. Within the pitch-black color, there was a tinge of blood. That energy was full of corrosive effects, as if it wanted to erode Xiao Bai completely and disappear. Tang Yin's body trembled, and a trace of worry appeared on his face. The Shura sect demons' methods were extremely vicious. Their true energy actually contained corrosive effects, which was simply disgusting. He did not know if Xiao Bai could withstand it. He turned his head to look at Bufang, only to find that Bufang did not have the slightest trace of worry. Bufang's eyes were still so indifferent, looking at the Shura sect expert in the air, as if he was looking at a dead man. The Shura sect expert looked at Xiao Bai, who was wrapped up in the giant energy ball, and suddenly burst into laughter in the air. However, his laughter soon came to an abrupt halt. Under his gaze, the energy ball was abruptly torn apart, and a fair and plump figure leaped out from the energy ball. Xiao Bai's entire body was shiny, and the corrosive true energy actually did not leave a single wound on him. The Shura sect expert's heart instantly turned cold. Then, under his gaze, Xiao Bai's fist was already smashing toward him. Boom! The enormous force was completely beyond his expectations. With a swoosh, his entire body was smashed into the ground by Xiao Bai's fist. The 5 talisman magic arrays also broke away from his control and floated in the air. Xiao Bai landed with a loud bang. His purple eyes became even more sinister, and the light in his eyes swept across the battlefield, causing the surrounding soldiers to subconsciously retreat. The 2 armies that were fighting at close quarters also stopped fighting. One by one, they spurred their horses to stand behind the 2 sides, watching the battle unfold. Mo Lin and Zhu Yu were clear that this battle would determine the outcome of the battle. If the Shura sect expert won, then the Western Mystery Third Corps would not be able to escape this calamity. If the Iron Lump won, then the final outcome of this battle would be hard to predict. A loud noise came from within the rubble, and the Shura sect expert rushed out. The black robe on his body was torn to shreds, revealing the sturdy, muscular body underneath. A purple light flashed in Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes. His arm turned into a giant machete, and his figure once again burst forth. Blade light flickered and blade energy crisscrossed. The Shura sect expert roared. A long spear appeared in his hand, and he began to fight with Xiao Bai. His heart surged with anger, and he wanted to smash the iron lump into pieces. However, he soon discovered that he was completely no match for the puppet. The puppet was extremely powerful. Every time it attacked, he was knocked back. After a few times, the web between his thumb and index finger was torn, and blood splattered everywhere. A blade swept across, and he felt a chill in his chest. This blade almost sliced him in half. The Shura sect expert's eyes shrank, and a trace of terror instantly appeared on his face. Having almost died under the puppet's blade several times, he finally understood the gap between him and Xiao Bai. His heart turned cold. He glanced at Bufang, who was looking at him indifferently, and the corners of his mouth curled up, revealing a sinister expression. This is just a puppet. Since it's a puppet, it must have a controller. After killing your controller, I want to see if this puppet can still kill me. The Shura sect expert casually waved his hand. Instantly, a beam of black light shot out from his palm, rapidly expanding. Boom! With a loud bang, a giant black lizard landed on the ground. The lizard's eyes rolled around, and a murderous aura burst forth. Its 4 legs moved rapidly on the ground, and with a loud noise it sped toward Bufang. Its bloody mouth opened wide, and a monstrous stench gushed out. Its razor-sharp teeth gleamed under the sunlight. This was actually a 7th-grade spirit beast. Tang Yin's expression changed drastically. However, he was severely injured at the moment, so how could he resist this spirit beast giant lizard? Xiao Bai wanted to help, but he was firmly held back by the Shura sect expert. Even after withstanding 2 slashes from Xiao Bai, he still had to delay Xiao Bai. He kept on laughing, and his eyes were filled with excitement. Darling, bite this guy to death for me. I'll give you an extra meal when we get back. Ha ha ha. This was a spirit beast he raised, and its cultivation level was very high. He believed that a 6th-grade battle emperor like Bufang would be devoured in a single bite. He had been holding back from releasing this giant lizard because he didn't want to attract the attention of the Celestial Arcanum sect experts. Once this giant lizard was released, even an entire city would be slaughtered to the last man. Such a high-profile act. The High Priestess wouldn't allow them to do it. The scales on the giant lizard's body glowed brightly. Its body twisted, and its 4 claws swung rapidly. Rumbling sounds resounded behind Bufang. The faces of Zhu Yu's army changed. At this moment, all the soldiers' faces were drained of blood. This gigantic creature was simply a nightmarish existence. Smelling the disgusting stench, Bufang immediately furrowed his brows and curled his lips in disgust. Green smoke curled around his hand, and suddenly, a pitch-black kitchen knife appeared in his hand. A kitchen knife? A trace of disdain flashed across the Shura sect expert's eyes. A kitchen knife was useless. Roar! With a loud roar, the giant lizard swallowed Bufang in one gulp. Chapter 298. He was swallowed? In the distance, Zhu Yu's pupils shrank and his heart turned cold. The terrifying aura emitted by the giant lizard made his whole body tremble. He was the commander of the Western Mystery Army's Third Army, but his cultivation level was only that of a 6th-grade battle emperor. Bufang was also a 6th-grade battle emperor, but he was swallowed by the giant lizard in one gulp. Senior Bu. Tang Yin's heart tightened and he couldn't help but shout. He swung the long sword in his hand, sending waves of sword energy toward the giant lizard. However, the giant lizard rolled its eyes and swung its steel-like tail, sweeping away all the sword energy. The Shura sect warrior burst into laughter, his eyes filled with uncontrollable excitement. Although he was suppressed by the puppet in front of him to the point where he couldn't even let out a fart and his body was slashed by the giant machete, he believed that he would soon be able to press the puppet to the ground and give it a good beating. A puppet that had lost its master's control was just a pile of scrap metal. Boom! The Shura sect warrior was once again slashed by Xiao Bai's machete. Fresh blood spurted out and his whole body was sent crashing into the distance, causing the ground to shake violently. Damn it! Come on, come at me again! The Shura sect warrior struggled to get up from the ground, his eyes filled with a hint of madness. Damned iron lump, why don't you chop me to death? Xiao Bai's purple eyes flickered as he froze on the spot. Tang Yin's pupils shrank and so did Zhu Yu's. Mo Lin, on the other hand, was laughing excitedly. The puppet finally stopped moving. The Shura sect warrior threw his head back and laughed. His long hair was disheveled and his eyes were filled with viciousness. He swung his long spear and stomped on the ground. He actually dashed toward Xiao Bai, intending to pierce through the iron lump with his spear. He wanted to turn this iron lump into a hornet's nest. This spear strike condensed his essence, energy, and spirit, and he didn't hold back at all. Previously, when facing Xiao Bai, he felt like he didn't even have the ability to fight back. This made him feel extremely sullen. He was a battle saint, but he had never felt so sullen before. He wanted to return all the humiliation he had suffered to this lump of metal. Since Bufang was swallowed by the giant lizard, the Shura sect warriors weren't worried that the puppet would retaliate. The Shura sect originated from the southern region, and there were many secrets recorded within the sect, including many records regarding puppets. There was a puppet sect in the continent, and it was an extremely powerful sect. The members of that sect possessed many puppets, and each of them possessed extremely powerful battle prowess. However, once the puppet master was killed, these puppets would lose their battle prowess unless they were refined again. Since the puppet in front of him was so strong, it was very likely that Xiao Bai's face was related to the puppet sect. Since that was the case, he would be safe once he killed the puppet's master. As he laughed, the wind and clouds surged. As the spear pierced forward, a deep pit seemed to have been pierced through the air. Zhu Yu despaired and Tang Yin's face turned pale. Could it be that Senior Bu was really eaten by the gigantic lizard? Was the third core of Shi Xian really going to be destroyed here? Swoosh! However, just as the Shura sect warrior's spear was about to pierce Xiao Bai's body, the purple glow in Xiao Bai's eyes suddenly intensified. That glow was like a multicolored sunset, causing the Shura sect warrior's eyes to become misty. What the hell? The machete whizzed past, and the Shura sect warrior instantly felt a tearing pain. Half of his body was cleaved into two halves. The long spear fell powerlessly to the ground, and his whole body was ruthlessly slammed into the ground by a tremendous force. How is this possible? How can this puppet still move? A trace of madness and disbelief appeared in the Shura sect warrior's eyes. He lifted his head and saw Xiao Bai brandishing the machete in his hand, slashing at him. In the distance, the fork-spitting giant lizard's eyes suddenly widened, and its mouth opened wide. Then, a dazzling golden blade light flashed, and the giant lizard's mouth exploded. Blood splattered everywhere, and the lizard's painful howls could be heard. Amidst the vigorous blood mist, a figure slowly emerged. It was a skinny figure, carrying a large kitchen knife as he slowly emerged. True energy swirled around him, and a strong wind whistled past. The hazy blood mist was instantly blown away, revealing the skinny figure's appearance. Bu Fang's face was indifferent. He held the golden dragon bone kitchen knife in one hand, and the blade was emitting a dazzling golden light. With a wave of the kitchen knife, an enormous pressure arose. That pressure made Mo Lin, Zhu Yu, and the others' hearts sink. They were all quite shocked. However, the pupils of the giant lizard, whose mouth had been chopped off, shrank, and its body fell to the ground. It looked at Bu Fang's figure with a face full of terror. The pressure that came from a superior made it unable to summon any thoughts of resistance. "What's going on? Baby? Stand up and bite him to death for me. Don't lie there. Bite him." The Shura sect warrior's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. He covered his shoulder with one hand and bellowed angrily. Bu Fang's body froze when he heard that. He held the golden dragon bone kitchen knife in one hand and turned to look at the Shura sect warrior. "You want this beast to bite me? This beast dares to bite me?" Bu Fang said calmly. His voice wasn't loud, but it clearly reached the Shura sect warrior's ears. The warrior's pupils shrank as he saw Bu Fang raise the golden kitchen knife in his hand. The giant kitchen knife spun in the young man's hand, and then, swoosh! The speed was so fast that it was hard for the naked eye to follow. Countless golden knife lights swirled around, and it was so dazzling that it shocked the onlookers. Amidst a series of miserable howls, the giant lizard was dissected alive, and its skin was peeled off by Bu Fang. With his meteor knife skill, which had been cultivated to the extreme, dissecting a giant lizard was a piece of cake. A 7th-grade spirit beast ingredient. Not bad. Looks like I've found the next dish. With a flick of his hand, the giant golden dragon bone kitchen knife lost its golden glow and turned into a wisp of green smoke. Bu Fang kept it into the totem in his hand. Looking at the giant lizard ingredient, the corners of his mouth curled up. He was just fretting over how to prepare the next dish. He didn't expect to receive a 7th-grade spirit beast ingredient. The second dish that would satisfy the system would be ready soon. The Shura sect warrior was dumbfounded, and his eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. His baby was actually turned into Bu Fang's ingredient. A mouthful of blood rushed to his head, and he couldn't help but cough out a mouthful of blood. He was so angry at Bu Fang. He had raised this giant lizard since it was a baby, and it was his good companion, his precious baby. But now it had fallen here, and in the end it was going to be eaten by someone else. Unforgivable! I'm going to kill you! The Shura sect warrior's eyes were bloodshot. He crawled up from the ground and glared viciously at Bu Fang. However, just as he got up, an ice-cold glint of a blade flashed by, directly slicing him in half. Half of his body was flung high up into the air, and then he fell to the ground. Blood gushed out like a fountain. In the end, his eyes were still filled with unwillingness. Buzz, the magic array formed by the 5 jade talismans in the sky, suddenly trembled. Then, a misty white spiritual essence was extracted from the Shura sect warrior's corpse. The spiritual essence's face was filled with terror, and it bared its fangs and brandished its claws, trying to escape, but to no avail. The Shura sect warrior's spiritual essence was also sucked into the magic array formed by the jade talismans, and he let out a howl of terror. The jade talismans glowed with an incomparably warm light, and with a jolt in the air, it was as if it was being pulled by something, and it was actually trying to escape into the distance. Tang Yin's expression changed. He activated his sword art, and his figure dashed toward the jade talismans. This magic array had gathered at least tens of thousands of spiritual essences. Once it returned to the Shura sect warriors' hands, it would become a huge disaster. A cold sword light poured out in torrents. Tang Yin wanted to destroy this magic array. However, a sword will suddenly burst out from the surroundings of the magic array. It was a sword will that was filled with blood and slaughter. Tang Yin's figure suddenly stiffened. The long sword in his hand actually broke into pieces under this sword will. The sword will continued forward, crossing the vast sky, as if it wanted to obliterate Tang Yin. Xiao Bai suddenly leaped up high from the ground, slapped Tang Yin back to the ground, and used his fist to meet the sword will head-on. With a loud explosion, countless sword energies gushed out. Xiao Bai's figure was ruthlessly smashed down from the sky, and smashed into the ground, creating a huge crater. Blood dripped from the corner of Tang Yin's mouth, and he struggled to get up from the ground. He looked at the disappearing Jade Talisman magic array with lingering fear. That was the Supreme Sword Will. This magic array was actually protected by the Supreme Sword Will. As expected, the Shura sect really valued this magic array. What is the use of this magic array? Tang Yin's mouth was trembling, and his limbs and bones were all trembling at this moment. He still had lingering fears after almost dying under the Supreme Sword Will. Bufang's face was also somewhat solemn. However, he didn't care about the Supreme Sword Will or the disappearing Jade Talisman magic array. Arriving before the deep crater that Xiao Bai fell into, Xiao Bai climbed out of it. The corner of Bufang's eye twitched. Xiao Bai's body actually had a hideous sword wound. After all, this was only Xiao Bai's clone. If Xiao Bai's real body was here, then the Supreme Sword Will would be nothing. Patting Xiao Bai's chubby belly, Bufang sighed inwardly. The purple light in Xiao Bai's eyes had already dissipated, turning back into a warm red glow. He raised his hand to scratch his head, and the sword wound on his belly was actually healing at a speed visible to the naked eye. The surrounding people were all dumbfounded, and Mo Lin was the first to regain his senses. The Shura sect warriors were defeated. Mo Lin looked at Bufang with eyes full of fear. This guy, everyone, listen to my order. Retreat immediately. Mo Lin roared, then mounted his spirit horse, and without the slightest desire to continue fighting, fled into the distance. His subordinates followed one after another. Zhu Yu's army's morale was instantly boosted, and their battle cries shook the heavens. They actually chased after Mo Lin. For a moment, the situation was completely one-sided. However, Zhu Yu's army could only chase after the opponent and scare Mo Lin a little. It was impossible for them to kill him. Outside Mo Luo City, a beam of light flashed past, entering one of the towering tents. Inside the tent, an expert wrapped in a black cloak suddenly opened his eyes, raised his hand, and grabbed the talisman magic array floating in front of him. The 5 talismans on the magic array were densely covered in cracks, and this made the black-cloaked man's pupils shrink. This is the magic array controlled by New. Why did it fly to my place? Moreover, even the High Priestess sword will attached to it was shattered. It seems like New is in grave danger. The black-cloaked man took a deep breath, and his eyes were unreadable. Could it be that the Celestial Arcanum sect or the 100,000 Mountains made a move? Chapter 299. In the vast border city, an angry snort suddenly came from an ancient pitch-black iron tower. The voice wasn't loud, but it caused the 3 figures sitting cross-legged around the iron tower to open their eyes. Why is the High Priestess so angry? Who provoked the High Priestess? This was a figure shrouded in a pitch-black robe. His eyes were filled with confusion. Beside him were 2 other figures also shrouded in black robes. Who cares? In any case, those who provoke the High Priestess will not have a good ending. We, the 3 Bloodguards, just have to do our duty. Now that the Venerable Lord has begun to collect spiritual essences from all over the Empire, The day the departed soul orb is awakened will be the day our Shura sect rises. When that time comes, we must let those barbarians of the southern region know our terror." A faint laughter sounded, mixed with a cold snort. Then, the three figures once again closed their eyes. "Senior Boo, why did you dig 2 shallow pits?" Tang Yin's complexion was a little pale. The previous battle had seriously injured his body, causing his blood and energy to be a little chaotic. "Of course I dug these pits to cook. What else did you think I was doing? Digging graves for this beast? I'm not so kind as to dig graves for a beast that wants to eat me," Bu Fong said calmly. 2 huge pits were dug in the ground in front of him. The soil in the pits was dug out and scattered all over the ground, forming a small hill beside them. "Cooking? Digging pits can be used to cook?" This time, not only was Tang Yin a little confused, but the others also widened their eyes in confusion. Bu Fong didn't care about their doubts. He was very excited. Ever since he joined the cook's army unit, he didn't have any good ingredients, so he never had the chance to show off his skills. Now that he had this giant lizard, he might be able to cook a dish that would satisfy the system. "Say, Senior, the spirit leaves you wanted are here." In the distance, Wei Dafu and Long Kai were carrying a large pile of green leaves as they slowly ran over. These green leaves were densely covered in veined patterns, and there was even some faint spiritual energy dispersing from them. Clearly, these were not ordinary spirit leaves. Bu Fong indifferently nodded his head and instructed Wei Dafu and Long Kai to spread the spirit leaves into the pit. While Long Kai and Wei Dafu were busy, Bu Fong walked to the corpse of the giant iguana. The giant iguana had been dissected by him, and all the meat was scattered on the ground. However, Bu Fong had only gone through a simple dissection and didn't go through any meticulous sculpting. At this moment, he was going to process the giant iguana's meat. The giant lizard and the dragon clan were inextricably linked, so it should also possess the dragon clan's bloodline. These black scales were very hard, but under the dragon bone kitchen knife, they were quickly peeled off. After cleaning the giant iguana's meat, Bu Fong processed a huge piece of meat that was about the size of a millstone. The veined patterns on the meat were bright red, and it looked like a plump fish. He twirled the dragon bone kitchen knife in his hand, and then cut a few holes on the giant iguana's meat. Bu Fong took out some spirit herbs that he found from the rations. These spirit herbs were of a very low grade, but they were pretty good for seasoning. He chopped these spirit herbs into small pieces and spread them on the giant iguana's fresh meat. The giant iguana's meat was neatly cut into pieces, but they were still connected by a point. "Senior, it's all done." Wei Dafu trembled as he stood up and respectfully said to Bu Fong. He didn't dare to be disrespectful. The kid in front of him was no longer the kid who had just entered the cook's army unit. He was afraid that Bu Fong would suddenly find him to settle the score. If that happened, he would have nowhere to hide in this army camp. "Give me the extra leaves," Bu Fong said as he put away the kitchen knife and looked at Wei Dafu. Wei Dafu's heart trembled, and he hurriedly stuffed all the remaining spirit leaves into Bu Fong's hands. After Bu Fong received them, he used the spirit leaves to wrap up the giant iguana's meat and placed it into the shallow pit. Then, he used the soil to cover half of the pit. This. Wei Dafu's eyes flashed with a hint of confusion. He had been cooking for so many years, but he had never seen such a strange cooking method. Digging a pit to cook? How was he going to cook the giant iguana's meat? However, in the next moment, Bu Fong's instructions made him understand. This was because Bu Fong had ordered someone to pile a huge pile of firewood on top of the half-filled pit. Finally, he used true energy to ignite the flames, causing the firewood to burn. The flames were monstrous, and thick smoke billowed. Bu Fong clasped his hands behind his back in satisfaction as he looked at the surging flames. Behind him, the crowd looked at each other in dismay. Tang Yin, Zhu Yu, Wei Dafu, and the others could not understand this dish at all. This cooking method was simply unheard of. Cooking like this, without understanding the situation in the dish at all. How is it possible to make a delicious dish? Wei Dafu curled his lips. Even though Bufang had been slapping his face, he still did not believe that this method could be used to cook a delicious dish. After all, this method was unheard of. There were a total of 2 pits. Bufang used the same method to wrap up the giant iguana's meat with spirit leaves and placed it into the pit. Then, he filled half of the pit with firewood and burned it. This method was the cooking method of a famous dish in Bufang's previous world. Bufang had adapted this method and made some slight changes to make it more suitable for cooking the giant iguana's meat. Bufang stood in front of the raging fire and rubbed his chin. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly. Flour iguana meat? It feels so weird. Bufang muttered to himself with a strange expression on his face. He slowly walked around the 2 shallow burning pit. From time to time, he would send a ball of true energy into the shallow pits. His true energy was infused into the flames, causing the flames to become even more vigorous. Senior Bu's cooking methods are really strange. Tang Yin and the others did not know whether to laugh or cry. They thought that Bufang was just messing around. Then, everyone began to go about their own business. This fire burned for about 6 hours. The light from the flames filled the sky and illuminated the entire military camp. The scorching sun in the sky had also set. Night fell and 2 crescent moons hung high in the sky. Bufang stood in front of the 2 burning fires. His eyes narrowed and he took a deep breath. Then, he raised his hand and slapped it toward the fire. Vigorous true energy surged out from his body and directly smashed into the 2 bonfires, causing the flames on the 2 bonfires to be extinguished in an instant. Thick smoke billowed up like 2 intertwining black dragons soaring into the sky. The attention of Tang Yin and the others was attracted. One by one, they walked out of their tents and came to Bufang's side. Many soldiers were also attracted and surrounded the area. They all looked at Bufang curiously. Is the cooking done? Tang Yin's eyes instantly lit up. Everyone walked to Bufang's side with a curious expression on their faces. They wondered how a dish cooked using this cooking method that they had never seen before would taste. A few soldiers walked up and swept away the black charcoal on the ground, revealing the charred soil. Dig up the soil. Bufang looked at the soldiers and said, "Be careful, don't destroy the dish inside." Could this really be used to cook a dish? Because the soil was burned, all the moisture inside had been burned away. Therefore, it was a little difficult to dig because the soil had become extremely hard. After busying themselves for a while, the soldiers finally dug up the soil and touched the spirit leaf inside. When the spirit leaf was plucked out, the originally lush spirit leaf had actually become yellow and withered, as if it had lost all its spirit. Everyone's pupils shrank and a strange expression appeared on their faces. Because from the appearance of the spirit leaf, they could roughly determine what would happen to the giant iguana meat inside. It seemed like Owner Bu had failed this time. Did he fail? Tang Yin thought. However, Bufang's expression did not change in the slightest. He walked to the shallow pit and pulled out the yellowish spirit leaf. Then, with a grab of his hand, he directly grabbed a large piece of meat wrapped in the spirit leaf. The spirit leaf on the outside of the meat was also yellow and had lost all its spirit energy. It's here. Everyone became spirited and stared at the spirit leaf. Underneath the spirit leaf was Bufang's dish, the 7th grade giant iguana meat. Even though they had yet to smell the aroma, many people could not help but feel hungry when they thought that it was the giant iguana meat. After all, it was the meat of a 7th grade spirit beast. How could they not look forward to it? Not everyone had the chance to eat the meat of a 7th grade spirit beast. Green smoke curled up and the dragon bone kitchen knife appeared in Bufang's hand. With a twirl of the knife, Bufang lifted the dragon bone kitchen knife, as if it was light, and gently swiped it across the top of the yellow spirit leaf. As the kitchen knife swiped across, the yellow spirit leaf actually split open. From the split opening, a dazzling light beam shot out. Beggar iguana meat done. Chapter 300. One beam of light. Two beams of light. Densely packed. It filled everyone's eyes. The light was too dazzling, causing the people who had been staring at the dish to squint their eyes. In the distance, Wei Dafu's entire body trembled. His eyes widened in disbelief. He stretched out his finger, pointing at the dish that was emitting beams of light. His mouth couldn't close. A dish that can light up? The shock in Wei Dafu's heart was almost indescribable. It was the first time he had seen such a dish that could light up. To be able to make a dish glow, it was a realm of cooking that he could never reach in his entire life. The light disappeared, but the people's eyes couldn't move away. They were completely captivated. As the beam of light dissipated, a wave of rolling hot air filled the air. The hot air surged upwards like a dense mist, and a special meaty aroma filled the air, lingering in the hearts of everyone present. This was a very special aroma. There was the aroma of meat, the fragrance of grass, and a kind of intoxicating flower. Three special and different feelings mixed together, forming this unique aroma. The meat quality is just right. Bufang used the dragon bone kitchen knife to gently press on the giant iguana meat that was exposed after the spirit leaves were peeled off. Instantly, the oil seeped out. The giant iguana meat was full of elasticity, overflowing with luster, and was quite tempting. Bufang took out this bag of meat, placed it on the ground, and completely cut open the spirit leaf. The whole piece of giant iguana meat was exposed, and the aroma burst out unrestrainedly, almost enveloping the entire army camp. Smells so good. I want to eat it. I want to be drunk in this meat aroma. I've never smelled such a delicious meat aroma before. The soldiers were all intoxicated. Their eyes were somewhat blurred, and they couldn't help but smile as they shook their heads. Bufang smelled the aroma of the giant iguana meat. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lip. Then, he spun the dragon bone kitchen knife in his hand, twirled it, and directly cut the giant iguana meat. The people only saw a flash of knife light in front of them. In the next instant, Bufang finished cutting. From afar, the giant iguana's meat seemed to be intact. However, upon closer inspection, everyone could see that the giant iguana's meat was covered in fine knife marks. Long Kai, bring the bowl over. Bufang said indifferently to Long Kai, who was watching from afar with his mouth wide open. Long Kai came back to his senses, and his eyes immediately lit up. He took a stack of pottery bowls and ran over. With a twist of the dragon bone kitchen knife, Bufang slapped a piece of meat. Immediately, a shiny piece of giant iguana meat, dripping with warm oil, flew up and fell into the bowl. Steam rose up, blurring Long Kai's eyes. Long Kai's eyes widened and he couldn't help but gulp down a mouthful of saliva. Send it to them. It's everyone's dinner tonight, Bufang said. Only then did Long Kai reluctantly walk toward Tang Yin and the others with the piece of giant iguana meat in his hands. Under Zhu Yu's courtesy, the first piece of giant iguana meat fell into Tang Yin's hands. Holding a pair of chopsticks, Tang Yin looked at the piece of meat with a face full of excitement. As he smelled the fragrance of the meat, his stomach let out a rumbling sound. When the chopsticks pressed down on the giant iguana meat, the oil immediately spilled out and the fragrance filled the air. Using the chopsticks to pick up the meat, Tang Yin brought it to his mouth with trembling hands and took a bite. The chewiness he imagined did not appear. This piece of meat was actually very tender and smooth. The moment it entered his mouth, the texture was surprisingly good. It was soft in his mouth, and with a light bite, it felt like his oral cavity was being massaged. When the giant iguana meat entered his stomach, it was as if a small furnace was burning in his abdomen. Waves of energy filled his entire body, invigorating him. As the fiery heat surged, Tang Yin felt waves of spirit energy flowing out and spreading to his limbs and bones, allowing him to feel that his injuries had recovered by a large margin. In the distance, Bu Fang slapped again and another piece of giant iguana meat flew into the pottery bowl. Just like that, he distributed the pieces of giant iguana meat to the soldiers. A big piece of giant iguana meat was cut into several hundred pieces and distributed to the soldiers. It also allowed many soldiers to eat to their heart's content. The giant iguana meat from the second pit was also taken out. It had the same taste and the same heat. Bu Fang also distributed this piece of meat to every soldier so that most of them could taste this delicacy. Of course, he also kept a piece for himself. As he ate the gigantic iguana meat, his eyes slightly narrowed. This was because the taste of the gigantic iguana meat was really not bad. The meat of a 7th-grade spirit beast was rich in spirit energy. Moreover, the meat of this gigantic iguana was different from that of ordinary spirit beasts. It's indeed very delicious. Bu Fang was very satisfied. Using the beggar's chicken method to cook it could perfectly retain the fragrance, causing the meat to be extremely tender and smooth, and the texture to be excellent. There were many soldiers, but there wasn't that much giant iguana meat. Therefore, many of the soldiers' faces were filled with grief because they didn't get to taste this delicacy. They simply didn't want to live anymore. The meat fragrance that was still lingering in the air made them want to eat it. Everyone's face was filled with desire. However, it would take a lot of time to cook such a piece of giant iguana meat. Therefore, they could only eat the dishes made by the other cook's army unit. Their hearts ached so much that they couldn't breathe. After cleaning up, Bu Fang also stretched his waist and let out a long breath. His face revealed a hint of relief. The system's notification rang in his mind. Obviously, this flower iguana was evaluated as qualified by the system. This flower iguana was cooked using the famous beggar's chicken method from his previous world. The technique was unique and the cooking method was unheard of. In addition, the giant iguana meat was so delicious that it was recognized by the system, so Bu Fang didn't think there was any problem. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, the Third Army continued to move forward. They had to speed up and reach Mo Luo City as soon as possible. The goal of this trip was to rescue Mo Luo City. They were ambushed before they even reached Mo Luo City. Mo Luo City must be suffering from a terrifying bombardment. Perhaps it had already been breached. Even if it wasn't breached, it was probably in imminent danger. Mo Luo City. 2 bright moons hung high in the pitch-black night sky, emitting a cold radiance. The dilapidated city wall was full of ravines. Soldiers patrolled on top of the wall. They were wearing armor and holding torches. They were fully focused and didn't dare to relax for even a moment. Suddenly, the sound of bowstrings snapping resounded in the pitch-black night sky. A dense rain of arrows whistled down from the sky. These arrows smashed onto the city wall, producing tinkling sounds. The somewhat dilapidated city wall was also smashed into pieces. Enemy attack! The soldiers on the city wall suddenly roared. Then, earth-shaking battle cries burst out from below the city wall. Figures emerged from the night sky, charging toward the city with surging battle intent. A figure holding a magic array formed by 5 jade talismans rose into the air. His face was extremely solemn, even a little gloomy. He originally wanted to carry out a normal war and slaughter, but Nu Er's death made him feel a sense of urgency. He had to speed up the process of the war. Floating in the void, the Shura sect warrior raised his hand. Then, numerous small blood-colored flying swords flew out of his palm. The flying swords circled in the air, whistling through the air. Then, they shot out, tearing the air apart. Boom! The city wall was suddenly bombarded by the flying swords. The violent tremors caused the soldiers on the city wall to bleed from their orifices. Damned demon! With a loud roar, a white-robed figure dashed out from Mo Luo City, soaring into the sky with a fierce, murderous intent. Hu Yifeng's face was full of murderous intent. He glared at the black-robed figure in the void with an imposing manner. This was the person who killed several of his brothers from the 13 bandits of Majo. This enmity was absolutely irreconcilable. The battle in the sky once again began, but it was obvious that Hu Yifeng was at a disadvantage. Sparks scattered, and the flames of war soared to the sky. The cruel war in Mo Luo City was still ongoing. The white, misty soul essences that were still warm were extracted from the corpses and mixed into the jade formation, making the formation look even more demonic. The first ray of morning sunlight leaped over the border of the plain, blooming with a bright red light. The third corp of Western Mystery City finally saw the majestic figure of Mo Luo City from afar. As they approached Mo Luo City, the air was filled with a chilling intent. The ground was dyed red with blood, and scattered corpses were scattered all over. There were enemies, and there were also Mo Luo City's defenders. The soldiers of the Third Corp of Western Mystery City were silent. They felt a heavy and indescribable sorrow. When they got close to the city gate, the guards on the city wall actually pulled their bowstrings and shot sharp arrows filled with energy towards them. The arrows pierced the ground. Zhu Yu stopped his troops with a grave expression. His lips trembled as he looked at the swaying flag above Mo Luo City. Mo Luo City had fallen. Retreat! Zhu Yu helplessly gave the order after taking a deep look at Mo Luo City. The soldiers of the Third Corp retreated to the rear. They had painstakingly rushed to Mo Luo City, but unfortunately, Mo Luo City was still invaded. With their military strength, it was no different from a fool's dream to take down Mo Luo City again. Thus, Zhu Yu ordered the troops to retreat. Mo Luo City had fallen, and the next city to be besieged would be Western Mystery City. Zhu Yu had to return to Western Mystery City and inform the city lord. On the city wall of Western Mystery City, Anai Yen stood with her hands clasped behind her back. Her beautiful face was filled with seriousness as she gazed into the distance. Her heart felt heavy as she gazed at the dark clouds in the sky. She could feel that a terrifying crisis was rapidly approaching. The Western Mystery City was about to fall into a precarious situation. The Third Corp, which had gone to reinforce Mo Luo City, had unexpectedly returned. This further confirmed her suspicions. She walked down the city wall and arrived at the Third Corporation. She went to look for Tang Yin. After all, Tang Yin was her disciple. However, when she saw Tang Yin, she was slightly taken aback. This was because there was actually a skinny young man standing beside Tang Yin. This young man looked very familiar. Owner Bu? Why are you here? Anai Yen widened her eyes with a strange expression on her face. Chapter 301. Anai Yen widened her devastatingly beautiful eyes. Her moist red lips parted slightly as a trace of astonishment appeared on her face. Bufang, who had just walked out, subconsciously raised his head when he heard the exclamation. He blinked his eyes when he saw a familiar beautiful face. It's you. What a coincidence, Bufang said. Actually, Tang Yin felt a little hurt in his heart. After his master saw Owner Bu, he was no longer in her eyes. She had completely cast him aside. Could she not treat him so differently? Behind Anai Yen was the Western Mystery City's city lord, Kong Yao, and a large group of people. Among them was the #1 expert of the Western Mystery City, Kong Xian. However, Kong Xian's face was a little gloomy at this moment. He had never seen Anai Yen with such an expression. He never imagined that the aloof third elder Anai would show such an expression to a man. Could it be that they knew each other? Therefore, Kong Xian's gaze fell on Bufang. He wanted to see what kind of divine being Bufang was. After Bufang and Anai Yen exchanged a few words, he felt a chill, and he couldn't help but feel puzzled. Lifting his head to look around, he found Kong Xian, who wasn't far from him, staring at him. The corners of Bufang's mouth twitched. He was a little speechless. Was this guy cross-eyed? Why did he keep glaring at him? The Third Corps of the Western Mystery City had suffered heavy casualties in this battle. After entering the city, Kong Yao's complexion became somewhat grave. Zhu Yu told Kong Yao about the encounters along the way, which made the Western Mystery City's city lord's complexion even more unsightly. The fall of Mo Luo City was not good news. This meant that the Western Mystery City was about to face a great crisis. Moreover, the number of spirit beasts in the vicinity of the Western Mystery City had been increasing recently. It seemed that the triennial spirit beast tide was about to hit the Western Mystery City. This was another test for the city. There were enemies in front of them and a spirit beast tide behind them. The Western Mystery City was completely surrounded by enemies from both sides. The spirit beast tide occurred once every 3 years. The spirit beasts that surged out of the 100,000 mountains would attack humans in a frenzy. Therefore, the villages and towns near the Western Mystery City would be trampled by the spirit beasts during this time. At this time, the Western Mystery City would open its gates and allow the citizens of the surrounding villages to enter the city, almost as a matter of convention. The Western Mystery City was resisting the spirit beast tide. Once it was over, the citizens would be allowed to return. However, this year's spirit beast tide really came at the wrong time. Bufang returned to the cook's army unit's tent. Behind him, Anai Yen actually followed him back to the tent. Ever since she found out that Bufang was actually practicing his culinary skills in the cook's army unit, she was extremely excited and insisted on following him. Anai Yan's culinary skills were very good, but her desire for delicacies was also not low. It was a rare opportunity to eat Owner Bu's dishes. For the next few days, Bufang did not cook as many dishes as before. This was because his identity had been recognized by Anai Yen and Tang Yin. Hence, he returned to his usual indifferent self and only cooked a limited number of dishes each time. After experiencing Bufang's fearsomeness, Wei Dafu no longer dared to provoke Bufang. He gave all the spirit energy ingredients to Bufang first so that Bufang could cook to his heart's content. With enough spirit energy ingredients, Bufang originally wanted to cook a dish that would satisfy the system in one go. However, after cooking several dishes, he still failed. He had completely lost the feeling of success from before. This gave Bufang a headache. As time passed, the atmosphere in the Western Mystery City became more and more tense. Roars of beasts could often be heard outside the city. Nowadays, the Western Mystery City was not allowed to leave the city without permission. This was because once they left the city, they would easily be attacked by spirit beasts and fall into danger. In order to protect the citizens, they were not allowed to leave the city. Sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. The rich aroma of the dishes surged out from the tent. Steaming hot air rolled like a long wriggling snake. Bufang held the ladle and shook the wok. Instantly, the dishes in the wok were scooped into the ladle and poured into the porcelain plate on the table. The colorful and fragrant spirit energy dishes were very delicious. Just by looking at the appearance of the dishes, one would have a boundless appetite. Anai Yen sat at the side without a care for her image. When she saw Bufang's dish, she unceremoniously swallowed it with her chopsticks and stuffed it into her mouth. Anai Yen really admired Bufang's dishes. This was because Bufang's control over the spirit energy of the ingredients in his dishes had reached an unimaginable level. It was extremely difficult to preserve the spirit energy in the dishes. Even Anai Yen was a little tempted by this kind of skill. Delicious! Anai Yen stuck out her tongue and licked her red lips with a smile. However, there was not the slightest hint of joy on Bufang's face. Instead, he sat on the chair with his brows tightly furrowed. Although the taste of these dishes was really good, they were still lacking compared to the flower lizard. None of the dishes could pass the system's evaluation. Bufang couldn't help but feel anxious. A few hundred miles away from the Western Mystery City was the crossing of the 100,000 mountains. Since ancient times, the 100,000 Mountains had been known for its precipitous terrain. Even a 7th-grade battle saint would not dare to step into it. The Western Mystery City had been well guarded for the past few days. There were always people patrolling the city walls. Someone stood on the city wall and gazed in the direction of the 100,000 Mountains. He saw a cloud of dust billowing toward the city like a raging wave. The patrolling soldier's expression changed, and he hurriedly informed the Western Mystery City Lord. Kong Yao climbed up the city wall and gazed at the billowing cloud of dust. His face trembled and became somewhat pale. "The tide of spirit beasts in the 100,000 Mountains has begun. Pass down my order. Erect the city gates." After half a day, a violent tremor could be felt. Even those who stayed in the Western Mystery City could clearly feel it. It was a tremor that made their hair stand on end. Boom! Boom! The deafening roars of beasts caused the ground to tremble violently. The city wall was densely packed with soldiers. They gazed at the tide of spirit beasts below the Western Mystery City. Their complexions became pale, and they could not muster the slightest courage to resist. The tide of spirit beasts seemed to have turned into an ocean. Although the spirit beasts were not very powerful, and were mostly composed of 3rd and 4th grade spirit beasts, there was no lack of 5th and 6th grade spirit beasts. The tide of spirit beasts originates from the 100,000 Mountains. At this time, even the clear sky pagoda in the 100,000 Mountains must be sealed. Even the powerful clear sky pagoda cannot withstand such a tide of spirit beasts, and Ai Yen said as she stood on the city wall. Bufang and Tang Yin also gazed at the tide of spirit beasts. The number of spirit beasts was beyond imagination. Bufang had never seen so many spirit beasts before. Bufang furrowed his brows as he gazed at the spirit beasts. No one knew what he was thinking. Tang Yin, on the other hand, let out a deep breath and released the depressed air in his chest. Faced with so many spirit beasts, they seemed powerless. They did not know how so many spirit beasts came out from the 100,000 Mountains. However, the 100,000 Mountains was vast and continuous. It was not difficult for it to carry so many spirit beasts. After all, the 100,000 Mountains was the barrier of the southern region. It was said that there was another world beyond the 100,000 Mountains. There was a vast land beyond the 100,000 Mountains. However, very few people had ventured out, so they were not very clear about it. Roar! It was a giant crocodile. Its entire body was covered with sharp armor that exuded a dense chill. Its long and narrow mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. As it bit down, it brought along waves of sharp energy. Its 4 claws crawled on the ground at an extremely fast speed. A white wolf with snow-white fur was as swift as the wind. It galloped across the vast land, leaving a trail of thick smoke behind it. There was also a giant fiery red lion, an elephant covered with needle-like long hair, and a tortoise carrying a tortoiseshell on its back. These spirit beasts were of extremely high levels. As they walked, there were no other spirit beasts running around them. Instead, they formed their own territories. These spirit beasts were all charging toward the Western Mystery City. The complexions of everyone on the city wall became extremely unsightly. They were all somewhat anxious. However, as Bufang paced on the city wall, his expression was somewhat different from the rest of the people. He looked at the numerous spirit beasts below him with a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was currently very distressed because he couldn't make a third dish that could satisfy the system. If he couldn't make a dish, he wouldn't be able to complete the mission and obtain the reward. In the end, he came to the conclusion that the ingredients in the cook's army unit were too poor. There were no good ingredients. If there were good ingredients, Bufang felt that his third dish would easily satisfy the system. As for how to obtain better ingredients, Bufang's gaze fell on the vast ocean-like tide of spirit beasts below him. This large number of spirit beasts was a disaster in the eyes of others. However, to Bufang, it was a storehouse of ingredients that was as vast as the sea. As soon as this idea appeared, it exploded in Bufang's mind. It became more and more intense, causing Bufang's gaze and breathing to become somewhat rapid. Ai Yen and Tang Yin looked at Bufang with a puzzled expression. Both of them saw the fanaticism in Bufang's eyes. They were taken aback as they looked at the tide of spirit beasts below them. Then, they looked at Bufang's completely uncoordinated expression. "Master, do you think Owner Bu will rush down there?" Tang Yin whispered to Ai Yen. Ai Yan's complexion also stiffened. "Don't talk nonsense. The look in Owner Bu's eyes is just the way he looks at his ingredient." The way he looks at ingredients. Tang Yin's face scrunched up as he prayed in his heart. "Owner Bu, please don't act recklessly. Right now, it's hard to say who is whose ingredient." Chapter 302. The deafening roars of the beasts resounded through the sky and reverberated throughout the western mystery city, causing the hearts of the citizens to tremble. On top of the city wall, the crowd gazed at the surging tide of spirit beasts with different expressions. Some wore a solemn expression, like the beautiful Ai Yen. Some were deathly pale, like the city lord Kong Yao. Some were terrified, like the soldiers on the city wall. However, there was one person whose expression was completely different from the rest. He actually revealed a joyful expression, joyful. Looking at the surging tide of spirit beasts, what the hell is with that joyful expression? Tang Yin's heart twitched as he looked at Owner Bu's crazed and joyful expression. He felt that he would never be able to understand Owner Bu's thought. At this moment, Bufang was indeed very excited. For the past few days, he had been thinking about how to make a dish that would pass the system's evaluation. However, the grade of the ingredients provided by the cook's army unit were too low. Previously, he had used ordinary ingredients to make the Four Treasures soup, and the system had already approved it. If Bufang wanted to continue using this method, it would not work. This was also what gave him a headache. Just when he was worrying about the lack of good ingredients, he encountered the once-in-3 years tide of spirit beasts. This was simply as timely as rain after a long drought. "Father, don't worry. Although this tide of spirit beasts is frightening, it's not like we haven't encountered one in so many years. Let's not provoke it. After today, the tide of spirit beasts will naturally retreat." Although Kong Xian's expression was somewhat ugly, he still forced himself to speak to City Lord Kong Yao. City Lord Kong Yao nodded. Every time he encountered a tide of spirit beasts, it was a huge blow to his spirit. However, as Kong Xian said, all they could do now was to stay in the city. After a day, the tide of spirit beasts would naturally retreat. Roar! From all directions, the roars of powerful 7th-grade spirit beasts resounded incessantly, deafening the ears. The crowd standing on top of the city wall felt as though the city wall was trembling slightly due to the beasts' roars. "Do you want to eat more delicious gourmet dishes?" After the beasts' roars, Bufang suddenly turned his head to look at Ai Yen, who was beside him. The corners of his mouth curled up as he spoke to her. Ai Yen was instantly stunned. Tang Yin was also dumbfounded. "Owner Bu, what did he mean by this? Do you really King treat these terrifying spirit beasts as ingredients?" Tang Yin felt that the world had turned dark. Moreover, he had a bad premonition. Given his master's personality, delicacies? Even more delicious delicacies? Ai Yan's beautiful eyes instantly lit up like a sparkling and translucent gem. "Yes, I promise it will be delicious." Bufang nodded solemnly. "Tell me, what do you need me to do?" Ai Yen stuck out her little red tongue and licked her red lips as she said excitedly. Tang Yin immediately facebombed. He knew it. His master would become extremely excited at the mention of delicacies. This was an illness that had to be treated. However, what Bufang said next made Tang Yin feel even more hopeless. "Do you see that fiery red lion? The lion meat roasted by the flames will definitely be very fragrant and tender." Also, there's that elephant covered in spikes. Those spikes are only a cover to protect its excellent meat quality. We have to see the essence through the appearance. I can guarantee that the elephant meat will definitely be delicious. Also, there's that giant mountain tortoise. Its shell is brimming with essence. If its meat is cooked properly, it will definitely be a great tonic. The 7th grade spirit beasts were all evaluated by Bufang. Following Bufang's comments, Yan's eyes became brighter and brighter. Are you saying that all the 7th grade spirit beasts below are excellent ingredients? Which one do you need to deal with? Bufang was stunned for a moment. Then, the corners of his mouth curled up as he straightened his body. He looked at the surging tide of beasts below. Green smoke curled up from his hand as a pitch-black dragon bone kitchen knife appeared in his hand. He held the knife horizontally and pointed it at the tide of beasts below. Everything the knife points at is an ingredient, Bufang said heroically. Yan was dumbfounded. Tang Yin was dumbfounded. Kong Yao, Kong Xian, and the other generals of Western Mystery City all looked at Bufang as if they were looking at an idiot. Was this guy retarded? There was a tide of beasts below, and he was still talking about ingredients. Once he charged down, it was hard to say who would be whose ingredient. Perhaps tomorrow, he would be the feces of this group of spirit beasts. Senior Boo, let's not fool around. This is a tide of beasts. After the tide of beasts is over, we can take our time to plan our hunt, Tang Yin said with a pained expression. His funny, gluttonous master and the maverick owner Boo. He always felt that they were going to do something incredible. Will it really be delicious? However, just as Tang Yin expected, Yan stared at Bufang with sparkling eyes and asked, "If it's not delicious, you can hit me." Bufang nimbly moved his hand and the dragon bone kitchen knife in his hand immediately started to dazzle. "All right. Then this old lady will believe you this once, for the sake of delicious food." Yan suddenly squinted her eyes, and her beautiful face bloomed into a dazzlingly beautiful smile. Bufang patted Xiao Bai's belly, who was standing behind him, and said, "Xiao Bai, let's go." "Go what?" Besides Tang Yin and Yan, the others on the city wall were all dumbfounded as they looked at Bufang. In the next moment, their mouths were wide open, and they looked at Bufang as if they were looking at an idiot. Under their gazes, Bufang actually leaped up, stepped on the city wall, and fiercely leaped down the city wall. Oh my God! Is this guy courting death? Is there a tide of beasts below? Don't act like you're jumping into a bathtub, okay? Isn't it very unfriendly? Has this Xiao Bai's face turned silly from fear? Jumping down to feed the spirit beast? The crowd couldn't understand Bufang at all. They all leaned on the city wall, stretched their necks, and stared down. Swoosh! Cool breeze blew, and a fragrant wind blew. Then, a beautiful figure also leaped up high. Her white chiffon skirt swayed in the wind, and her long black hair was like a dream. Yan actually jumped down as well. "Elder Ni!" Kong Xian's pupils shrank and he shouted with a hoarse voice. Lying on the city wall, he didn't want to live anymore. "You're so beautiful, how could you send yourself to death?" Bufang spread his legs, and one of his hands held the dragon bone kitchen knife, which shone under the sunlight. His whole body was like a gust of wind crashing down. Boom! The first to land was Xiao Bai. The whole ground shook and a deep depression appeared. Several spirit beasts were directly crushed to death by Xiao Bai. Then, Bufang's figure also landed, and he stepped on the back of a spirit beast, stomping it to the ground. Yan's body was as light as a swallow. Her white chiffon fluttered, and she nimbly stepped on the air, floating high above the group of spirit beasts. Her red lips slightly curled up, and her elegant finger gently pointed in the air. Then, the spirit energy around her body began to boil, turning into waves that spread in all directions. "Owner Boo, leave this lion to this old lady. Remember your promise. If it doesn't taste good, I will beat you up." Yan's pleasant voice rang out. Then, she turned into a jet of light, dashing toward the fire lion in the distance, whose entire body seemed to be burning with flames. "Believe me, there will be meat to eat," Bufang calmly said. Bufang straightened his body. After a brief moment of shock, the eyes of the spirit beasts in the surroundings became filled with hostility as they pounced on Bufang. The crowd on the city wall sucked in a breath of cold air. In their eyes, the group of spirit beasts below was like a swarm of ants, swarming toward Bufang's position. They piled up like a small mountain, and their numbers were simply frightening. Kong Xian straightened his body and let out a dry cough. He had forgotten that Elder Ni's cultivation level was very high, and she could fly in the air. She might not be going to her death. However, that kid was only a battle emperor who couldn't even fly in the air, yet he dared to rush down the city wall. Didn't he know that there were countless 6th-grade spirit beasts in this beast tide? Kong Xian looked at the ferocious spirit beasts that were pouncing toward that kid. For some reason, a trace of delight actually flashed in Kong Xian's eyes. For the past few days, Yan had been running to Bufang's place. Kong Xian had long been dissatisfied with Bufang. This time, Bufang actually went to his death, which saved Kong Xian a lot of trouble. Tang Yin facebombed. As expected, nothing good ever happened when Senior Bu and his master were together. In the distance, Yan's body was bursting with surging true energy. She fought against the 7th-grade tyrannical fire lion with her bare hand. However, Yan's cultivation level was very high, and she was able to suppress the fire lion. However, there was a beast tide all around them. While Yan was fighting with the fire lion, there were still many spirit beasts pouncing toward her, which made her feel a little troubled. However, everything was worth it for the sake of delicious food. She believed in Bufang. She believed that Bufang's culinary skills would definitely not let her down. Yan turned her head to look at Bufang's position, and her face suddenly stiffened. She realized that the place where Bufang was standing was covered by layers and layers of spirit beasts. The corner of her mouth twitched. She suddenly remembered that Bufang's cultivation level was only a 6th-grade battle emperor. Owner Bu. Could he have turned into the feces of spirit beasts? Boom! With a loud bang, a golden beam of light burst out from the layer upon layer of spirit beasts, soaring into the sky. It was extremely dazzling. A dragon's roar reverberated through the 9 heavens. An invisible wave spread out from the pile of spirit beasts. It was like the ripples created when a stone was thrown into a pond, spreading out in circles. Then, under the dumbfounded gazes of the crowd, the pile of spirit beasts suddenly exploded. A figure carrying a giant golden kitchen knife stood proudly. Beside the figure was a puppet whose eyes flickered with a purple radiance. This eye-catching duo slowly emerged from the pile of spirit beasts that had been blown apart. With a wave of the kitchen knife, the crowd of spirit beasts retreated in fear. Chapter 303. The golden radiance was dazzling and dazzling. An invisible dragon roar came from the kitchen knife in Bufang's hand. The true energy vortex in Bufang's dantian spun rapidly. True energy surged out, rushing into his limbs and bones, and pouring into the golden dragon bone kitchen knife in his hand. The dragon's might within the dragon bone kitchen knife had an invisible suppression on spirit beasts. This suppression allowed Bufang to move freely in this beast tide with ease. Carrying the huge kitchen knife, Bufang slowly walked toward the elephant in the distance. Its entire body was covered with sharp thorns. This was a 7th-grade spirit beast, the thorn mammoth. Its combat strength was very strong, and it had a violent temperament. Its long, barbed trunk was a terrifying killing weapon. With a sweep of its trunk, it would tear its prey apart alive, and then trample it into pieces. The dragon bone kitchen knife was able to greatly suppress spirit beasts that had the blood of the dragon race flowing through their veins. However, the hedgehog mammoth's dragon bloodline was very thin, so the dragon bone kitchen knife suppression was much weaker. Boom! Like a gust of wind, Xiao Bai rushed out. His mechanical eyes bloomed with purple light. His body swayed rapidly, rushing toward the huge thorn elephant. The thorn elephant curled up its trunk and let out an earth-shaking roar. The entire ground seemed to tremble. Its huge hooves ruthlessly pounded on the ground, causing the city wall to shake violently. Crushed stones rustled and fell, causing the experts on the city wall to feel a lingering fear. This was an extremely powerful spirit beast. However, Xiao Bai was not afraid at all. He directly rushed out, and his arm turned into a huge machete in the air. That was the thorn elephant's killing weapon. Its barbed trunk suddenly swung, as if it wanted to tear the sky apart. It ruthlessly smashed toward Xiao Bai's body. If it smashed into him, he would definitely be torn apart by those ferocious barbs. Everyone thought so as well. The pressure that this thorn elephant gave off was too terrifying. It was definitely an outstanding 7th-grade spirit beast. Swoosh. However, just when everyone thought that Xiao Bai was going to be smacked full of holes by the long nose, a blade light flashed by. The blade light was so fast that even their eyes could not follow it. Then, everyone's eyes widened as they saw that the thorn elephant's nose had actually been chopped off while it was still alive. Fresh blood spurted all over the ground. Feeling the intense pain, the thorny mammoth's barbs all over its body opened up and it violently rammed its body in all directions, trampling many of the spirit beasts around it into minced meat. Xiao Bai's body suddenly landed on the head of the thorn mammoth. The huge fan-like ears kept flapping. Xiao Bai's mechanical eyes flickered coldly. The machete fiercely chopped at the thorn mammoth's head, and a fist also smashed down. He continued to beat the thorn elephant in pain. Bufang held the kitchen knife with one hand as a golden radiance flowed around it. He turned his gaze to the old mountain tortoise that was carrying a huge shell on its back. This tortoise was also a powerful spirit beast. The surrounding spirit beasts retreated in fear from the pressure released by the dragon bone kitchen knife. They did not dare to approach Bufang at all. Bufang paid no attention to the low-grade spirit beast. Standing in front of the hill-like old mountain tortoise, Bufang's face revealed a hint of unconcealable excitement. A mountain tortoise was a great tonic. The mountain tortoise's head shrunk back into its shell. It must have felt the dragon's might and actually shrunk back. The tortoise's shell was extremely tough and was a natural shield. Ordinary people would not be able to do anything to it. Bufang's gaze was fixed on the tortoise's shell. When he saw the patterns on the shell, a slightly surprised expression appeared on his face. Suddenly, 2 rays of red light shone from within the pitch-black tortoise's shell. With a roar, a huge head shot out from within and charged toward Bufang. It was the old mountain tortoise's head. Its wrinkles were filled with the traces of time. The old mountain tortoise's eyes were bloodshot. It roared, opened its mouth, and bit down on Bufang. Bufang's pupils shrank. He did not expect that the old mountain tortoise would be able to resist the dragon's might and attack him. As expected, the longer it lived, the more crafty it became. Clang! Bufang blocked with the dragon bone kitchen knife. Since the old mountain tortoise could not bite down, it tried to ram its head into the dragon bone kitchen knife instead. The huge force sent Bufang and his knife flying far away. Bufang rolled and landed in the distance, then immediately got to his feet. He immediately stood up and his face gradually became cold. The true energy vortex in his body rotated faster, and the dragon bone kitchen knife's radiance became more intense. Boom! The stones under Bufang's feet shattered as he dashed forward. Holding the knife in one hand, he charged toward the old mountain tortoise. His dragon's might spread out, forcing the spirit beasts in the surroundings to retreat. The tortoise's shell was very hard. Naturally, Bufang would not foolishly use the dragon bone kitchen knife to hack at it. Putting aside the question of whether he could break it, even if he could, Bufang's true energy would be nearly depleted. If that happened, he would not even be able to maintain the dragon bone kitchen knife's form. That would be terrible. The old mountain tortoise roared. Its sharp teeth were very obvious. It stretched its neck, intending to bite Bufang. Bufang's figure moved, and he actually slid under the old mountain tortoise. With a slash of his knife, he directly chopped off one of the tortoise's legs. Then, with the giant dragon bone kitchen knife on his shoulder, Bufang shuttled around the old mountain tortoise. He constantly circled around the tortoise and occasionally slashed at its abdomen. Although the shell on the tortoise's abdomen was hard, it was much softer than the shell on its back. It was easy for Bufang to attack it. This could be considered a technique to deal with mountain tortoises. In the distance, Anai Yen quickly finished her battle. After all, she was an 8th grade war god. If she fought seriously, it would be easy for her to deal with a 7th grade spirit beast. The fire lion's giant body crashed to the ground, stirring up a cloud of dust. Anai Yen landed on the lion's back with an indifferent expression. Xiao Bai ruthlessly punched the thorn elephant. The barbs on its body were completely useless against Xiao Bai, and they were all smashed to pieces. The giant thorn elephant was actually smashed to the ground, unable to move. Rip! The sound of its shell being torn rang out. Then, under the astonished gazes of the crowd, fresh blood gushed out from the bottom of the tortoise's abdomen. The enraged old mountain tortoise suddenly collapsed to the ground, its life hanging by a thread. 3 7th grade spirit beasts were actually dealt with by these 3 fellows. The crowd atop the city wall sucked in a breath of cold air. The corner of Tang Yin's mouth twitched. These 3 fellows were indeed ruthless. Kong Xian's face was filled with dissatisfaction. Bufang was merely a 6th grade battle emperor. How could he possibly deal with a 7th grade spirit beast? How could he not be smacked to death by a 7th grade spirit beast? This was illogical. The spirit beasts in the Tide of Beasts, regardless of their type, were all in a frenzy. However, they still retained the instincts of spirit beasts, which was to fear the aura of experts. No spirit beasts gathered around the corpses of the 3 7th grade spirit beasts. All of them took a detour. Bufang exhaled deeply and patted the old mountain tortoise's shell. His gaze unexpectedly swept across the other spirit beasts. The crowd atop the city wall couldn't help but twitch their faces. What kind of person was this? Was a 7th grade spirit beast not enough to satisfy him? In the next moment, Bufang charged out with the kitchen knife on his shoulder. The Tide of Beasts quickly retreated, or rather, moved. Although it wasn't time for the Tide of Beasts to recede, the aura of the corpses of several 7th grade spirit beasts lying in front of the Western Mystery City's gate deterred the spirit beasts from approaching. They shifted their positions and retreated into the 100,000 mountains. Beads of sweat trickled down Bufang's forehead as he gazed at the herd of spirit beasts that retreated into the 100,000 mountains. His face was filled with reluctance. There were quite a few good ingredients among them. Yet they escaped just like that. If others knew what he was thinking at this moment, they would certainly be speechless. Xiao Bai returned to stand behind Bufang. Anai Yen was also panting as she returned. This battle had exhausted her. She had single-handedly killed 3 7th grade spirit beasts. There were a total of 8 7th grade spirit beasts, and she had killed 3 of them. She was ready to risk everything for the delicacies promised by Bufang. Owner Bu, if the delicacies you cook this time can't satisfy me, I will definitely beat you to death, Anai Yen said while gasping for breath. Bufang curled up the corners of his mouth and gave Anai Yen a reassuring look. Then, he ordered someone to open the city gate. Now that the tide of spirit beasts had receded, there was no harm in opening the city gate. With the help of the soldiers, the 8 7th grade spirit beasts' corpses were dragged back into the Western Mystery City. The citizens of the Western Mystery City were dumbfounded. They had never seen a 7th grade spirit beast in their entire lives, yet 8 of them had suddenly appeared. Moreover, all of them had been slaughtered. Looking at the ferocious elephant covered with barbs, it was simply terrifying. Owner Bu, What delicacies are you going to cook? 8 7th grade spirit beasts should be enough, right? An Yin asked. Wei Dafu and Long Kai also scrambled over. Although the 7th grade spirit beasts were already dead, the pressure emitted from their bodies still frightened them. Go and find me the biggest wok in the Western Mystery City. Find as many as you can. This time, I want to have a banquet for the entire army, Bu Fong said to Wei Dafu. The biggest wok. Wei Dafu was stunned for a moment. Then, he glanced at the 8 7th grade spirit beasts and immediately grunted. Adding the 7th grade giant lizard that Bu Fong had killed previously, that was a total of 9 7th grade spirit beasts. With so many 7th grade ingredients, what kind of dish was he going to cook? The citizens surrounded the area so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. The soldiers worked together to transport the corpses of the spirit beasts into the barrack. On this night, the barracks were ablaze with flames. 9 of the biggest wok in the Western Mystery City were placed in the open space of the barrack. Under each of the 9 wok were several cooks from the Army Cook's Army Unit. Everyone, including an Yin, was extremely curious. They really wanted to know what kind of dish Bu Fong was going to cook with these 9 spirit beasts. A dish with 9 7th grade ingredients. Just thinking about it made people excited. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.